both of those books, the Kennedy and Cuba book, and they repurchased the rights to JFK Vietnam will be featured as Hill and Wang American History book together as a set.
Oh, really? That's the one?
Yeah, Strauss Orange Road. It's a very prestigious house. So
Yeah.
I mean, it's good news, really, when you think about it.
It really is. Yeah, absolutely. Our spin on history.
Yeah, exactly. Fine.
Bob,
Yes.
make sure you mention its publisher, FSG.
Yeah, we were just talking about that.
You got to get the publisher a plug.
So it will be reissued in hardback, JFK?
No, in trade paper.
With
Kennedy and Cuba.
but it's going to first come out as a hardback in Cuba, right?
Kennedy and Cuba will be issued as a hardback. And JFK Vietnam is a trade paper together. Like I said, hardback, Strauss Orange Road. And the thing is that there'll be Hill and Wang American History books. That's a very extensive series. And Chomsky on the left, and Summers and those guys on the right.
Oh, okay. I just put it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, once you do it.
Good morning again. We are going to resume this panel with Mr. John Newman. John is an assistant professor of history at the University of Maryland. At this time as well, which is entitled Kennedy and Cuba, which will be published in 1996 by Farrar, Straus and Giroux as a Hill and Wang American History Series text, along with a trade copy of JFK and Vietnam boxed together. Welcome, Mr. John Newman.
Nobody can fill Peter Dale Scott's shoes. Peter, to me, is the dean, just an all-around super person and someone who, like many of you, has suffered for his courage in taking this on. He did go underground at some point in his life, and so I want to share with you a little anecdote of my own. I called him up one day. I was still a major in the Army. I was at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, going through the Command and General Staff College, which is sort of a finishing school for lieutenant colonels and colonels, and was at that point streaming towards the end of my manuscript in JFK Vietnam. I called him up and I said, and I meant that because I knew that I hadn't seen anything from him in a long time. And of course, most of you know, some of you know anyway, that he wrote Chapter 5 to the Gravel edition of the Pentagon Papers, and without the benefit of a lot of the documents, figured out, I think, very early on, an awful lot about the whole Vietnam issue. And it's a tremendous tribute to his intellect that he did that. Now, Peter has some special skills. He was a Foreign Service officer in Canada, and has traveled extensively overseas, so I can't possibly fill in what he would have told you this morning about, and he certainly could give us a very interesting perspective from an international perspective. So it's too bad Peter isn't here, and I'm sure he would like to apologize for not being here, but we can look forward to more from Peter. Let me just finish that anecdote by saying that recently he's been in my basement with my documents 3 or 4 times. He's been helping me, and he said, I just want to help you, John. I'm not going to ever want to meet you again. And happily, that's not true. Once Peter was revived and up and running again, he is again bitten and writing some very fine material. And I would expect to see that, maybe go to press next year sometime. So You haven't heard the last from Peter Dale Scott by any means on this subject. I would like to thank my colleagues, Al, Frank, and Ian, for some very interesting perspectives. It's more interesting than you might think as Americans to hear what what it seemed like, what it felt like to people in other countries. I'm not exactly out of school here. Although I was born in Dayton, Ohio. When I was 7, I moved to England, and was born and bred in the Bells Hall Wars. Caught me through and through, mate. And actually played soccer on the Holland Park private, which is for us public school, and spent some time in Switzerland, and most of my military career has been in East Asia, so I have spent a great deal of my time overseas and listened to the views of people from other countries about the assassination. I would sum it up this way. They have always felt the American people were a bit naive about this, that we were immature politically. And there is a lot to that, but I think they're wrong about this particular issue. And it's not because they should have known or shouldn't have known. It really has to do with the media, with the national media. And I think most people, like Frank, I think Frank's reaction is very interesting to come to a place like this and to see how serious, how many people, and how we really feel about this. But the public opinion polls tell the story, and the American people haven't been fooled, really, about this. So on this particular instance, there's less naivete than our foreign colleagues might actually think. So you actually get up close with Americans on this issue. Now, I must say, I'm not trying to defend Americans in particular for naivety. I think we probably are in many ways. But this is an issue where the American people are surprisingly resilient. I happened to have been 13 years old at the time. My parents were at the Rib Room in the Carlton Hotel. It was a Saturday, as you know. In England, it was dark, and I was sick. I didn't get to go, and there was a prime rib was the specialty there, and I liked prime rib. Well, I couldn't go get my prime rib because I was sick, and I was in my bathroom watching Wide World of Sports. I could be Wide World of Sports. Died. And my parents at that time were in the restaurant, and the waiter came up to them and informed them that the president was dead, and they left. And that's and they came home, and that's my remembrance. I was in England at the time, actually, when it happened. I would like to contribute something to this international perspective discussion this morning from the work that I've done, and would like to talk to you about U.S.-Soviet strategic relations and the U-2 program, and somebody who for right now I'm going to call Private X. And hopefully this will contribute to a broader discussion and understanding of the international ramifications of the case. Now, this particular international piece or perspective I want to give you isn't at the assassination or after the assassination, obviously, we've been talking about so far, but is before. In other words, what was the international situation before the assassination? Who was Lee Harvey Oswald? Was he married to this? And it turns out it's quite interesting. If you go back to those years, they were very, very different years. You would have to have grown up through them, and I, even at 13, was not old enough to really appreciate what it must have been like to dash under your desk in school and do rehearsals for nuclear war and people who were digging holes in their backyards and this sort of thing. It was an unusual time by any standard. And I mean, the American-Chinese bloodletting in Korea was still fresh in everybody's minds. In 1957, when Oswald went into the Marines, the country was still in the grips of the paranoid years, the very paranoid years of the Cold War and McCarthyism. The Soviet Union had just finished its bloody invasion of Hungary in 1956. The United States and the USSR were on the threshold of what I would call the second great technological chapter in the arms race, which was ballistic missiles. The bomb itself, of course, that threshold had been crossed in 19 1945 and between 1945 and 1950. Well, at this point, 1957, 58, 59, the competition is on delivery systems. Up to this point, we're talking about SAC bombers. Well, it takes quite a bit of time, especially if you don't have them in the air. Even if you have them in the air, you've got to go over the pole or fly through air defense. You put one of these things, one of these nuclear warheads on top of a ballistic missile, and it goes over there in 20 minutes. And so the whole nature of the strategic balance of power was being transformed by this deadly new technology, this capability to place something on the other side of the planet instantly. A capability, I would add, which also allowed us to put satellites in space and take a look, see around on the ground. So the technology we're talking about here really has two functions. Number one, to kill the enemy, and number two, to monitor what the enemy is doing. So it's a particularly interesting technology that we're talking about here in the ballistic missile. And intelligence rates. See, to launch a missile, an ICBM requires a rather great distance. Now, Russia has great distances, as you know. Understanding and monitoring a program like that, a ballistic missile program, requires more than human sources, human beings ferreting out stuff, and even radar emissions. You don't know whether a program is successful unless the thing actually lands where it's supposed to land. And there's only one way you can find that out. You gotta go take a picture of it. Even the country that launches it, they fly over the impact areas and photograph that it hits the X or not. So, in order to second echelon of administrative personnel departed for March, and the main detachment with 2 U-2 aircraft and equipment began deployment on 15 March 1957, and Detachment C was operational by the week of April 8, 1957. That's out of the new files, by the way. That's brand new information, and I'll tell you how new, 1994, in the January 1994 release. The Atsugi startup was good timing. For the Soviet ballistic missile program was just getting into full swing, and the first American intelligence report on a successful Soviet test launch of an ICBM lands on Eisenhower's desk in late August of 1957. The news looked grim, and the U-2 coverage continued to show hard evidence of a Soviet lead in the ballistic missile development program. By March of 1958, 10 to 15 Soviet ICBMs had been successfully launched to distances up to 3,700 miles. Nothing was put into reports that would betray the existence of this super, high techno weapon, if you want. It flew above known radar altitudes, I should say, and it was certainly out of the range of Soviet air defenses at the time. On September 12th, 1957, in other words, a few days after this first report lands on Eisenhower's desk, a young Marine, let's just call him Private X for the time because it works better. You know, when we say Oswald, we have this problem because, he shoots the president, and it sort of, screws everything up. You can't really appreciate it. He's just a private, a Marine private. Arrives at Atsugi Naval Air Station. 22 days later, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. 22 days after Private X arrived there, Sputnik went up on the tip of an ICBM. The Soviets followed with more launches and an American attempt there. We don't call it the missile gap anymore, we call it the missile bluff. How it's written up in history books. And the reason is because Khrushchev really didn't have them. He was feeding our fears by hinting at having this capability and the willingness to use it in several incidences that were threats, and not even veiled threats, to nuke Paris and London in various Middle East crises. The missile gap, however, was not yet, nor would it ever be concrete. For the ICBM had only been used for the space launch and one or two tests. It was something which was anticipated, you see, and CIA intelligence estimates in 1958 and 1959 projected the early prospects for Soviet ICBMs in the hundreds. Senator Stuart Symington actually predicted that the Soviets would have 3,000 ICBMs by 1959. The only factor which diminished the rising hysteria recalls again how it was in 1957 and 1958. He said, quote, when the Soviets started testing their missiles, they chose launching sites in the most remote and unapproachable wastelands, unquote. The location, of course, of the U-2s at Atsugi was designed specifically to get at that, at those ranges. Still, the limits to the number of possible U-2 flights rendered total coverage of all of the Soviet Union impossible, and the U-2 program was therefore insufficient to resolve the argument over the nature of the Soviet strategic threat. Ultimately, difficulties developed in the Soviet test program, difficulties which led to an interruption of their missile testing program between April 1958 and March of 1959. The resulting negative intelligence provided by U-2 coverage vitiated against the doomsday predictions of the Soviet ICBM deployments and allowed President Eisenhower to privately discount the arguments of the missile gappers. Publicly, however, Eisenhower faced journalists like the Alsop brothers, who wrote articles under such imaginative titles as After Ike the Deluge and Our Gamble with Destiny. Ike is this set right-wing attack because he wasn't launching the school bore into this huge program. Actually, he had set up our program. To counter Khrushchev's bullying tactics, then Secretary of State John Foster Dulles proposed to make the U-2 program public. After the launch of Sputnik, this was his recommendation, but Eisenhower declined to make a public spectacle out of our most sensitive and best means of verification, the U-2 program. Eisenhower did not want to give the Russians, who had vigorously protested U-2 violations of their airspace, a diplomatic and political coup, and he refused to declassify the program. So the U-2 program continued under very, very tight security, and its missions in 1958 and 1959 were increasingly critical in steering the intelligence community toward a more realistic assessment of the Soviet threat. Based on U-2 coverage, U.S. intelligence had concluded that the expected Soviet ICBM deployments would take place in late 1959 instead of early 1959, and by 1960, a CIA-sponsored national intelligence estimate predicted that the Soviet Union would deploy 35 ICBMs by mid-1960, and 140 to 200 by 1961. Actually, in the end, they had only deployed 4 by 1961. Far cry from the thousands that Senator Symington had been predicting. The critical intelligence provided by the U-2 program impacted, therefore, on the U.S. strategic calculus in the major crises, all the major crises, 1957 to 1959. U.S. behavior changed from constrained, and we feared Sputnik and the successful part of their program. It changed from constrained to emboldened, notwithstanding the highly publicized missile gap myth, as the truth about the Soviet missile program's failures and interruptions began to gradually emerge at the top secret and actually above top secret level. During the initial period of Soviet successes, American strategy was restrained. An American-backed Turkish invasion using 50,000 ground forces of Syria to topple pro-Soviet leadership there was preempted by Sputnik, and the American invasion force poised to invade Indonesia in December of 1957 was never sent in. As fate would have it, our Marine Private X, who had been at Insugi just at the point before and after Sputnik, became entangled in the Indonesian mess himself. From November 20th, 1957 through March 6, 1958, his unit, Max 1, joined other Marine units from maneuvers codenamed Operation Strongback in the South China Sea in the Philippines. Private X left for the Philippines on 20 November 1957 and returned to Atsugi in March of 1958. And this deployment was, in fact, part of the plans to intervene in the Indonesian crisis. Like the planned Turkish action in Iraq, it didn't happen. Private X's unit found another mission and landed in the Philippines at Kubi Point just before January 1st, 1958. They set up their little radar bubble at Kubi Point Air Base next to a special hangar that they recognized all too well. Inside that hangar was a U-2. From this location, Private X often tracked the U-2s as they approached Communist China. In March of 1958, Private X's unit returned to Atsugi. Then at precisely this important junction, the Soviet launch program hit the rocks. Publicly, Khrushchev continued to brandish his missiles during the ensuing Middle East crisis of May-August 1958. For his part, Eisenhower, in a speech to the UN, charged Khrushchev with ballistic blackmail. But this time, the president gave the order to intervene in Lebanon with American ground forces. Negative intelligence from the Atsugi operation undoubtedly factored into the president's decision to intervene. What I mean by that, if I wasn't clear enough before, is we now know that their program is on the rocks, and therefore Eisenhower's actions in these crises are more bold and aggressive. Let me be very clear about that. The Soviet reaction to the American and British troop landings in Lebanon was therefore, in the following crisis, muted. But the unfolding crisis soon widened to the Far East. With the Americans in Lebanon, Chinese leader Mao Zedong, in a struggle with Khrushchev at the time and wanting to embarrass him, saw an opportunity. So Mao provoked a crisis of his own by shelling Chinese nationalist islands in the Taiwan Straits in August. And naturally, guess whose unit took a little trip in for a closer look-see? Yeah, you guessed it, Private X. His unit deployed to Taiwan from September 14 through October 6, 1958, right bang in the middle of the crisis. Moreover, guess what was right by the location where Private X's unit worked? You got it, a U-2. Eisenhower, emboldened by intelligence from U-2 flights that the Soviet missile program had hit a snag, intervened in Lebanon and ignored the Chinese provocation. With the geopolitical initiative slipping away from him, Khrushchev launched a strategy to reverse this process by triggering a major new crisis in Berlin. In the protracted Berlin crisis which followed during the winter of 1958 and 1959, Khrushchev's renewed claims to strategic weapon supremacy were the crucial linchpin in his attempt to deter the West while making his demands over Berlin. Eisenhower, however, was still receiving good news from those U-2 flights that our Private X was watching take off and land every day at Atsugi. Eisenhower forced Khrushchev to back down. This crisis created favorable conditions, actually, though, for revolutionary success in Cuba, which I'm not going to go into today because we were distracted and because American attention was focused on Berlin. And Washington did not effectively handle the unfolding situation in Cuba, and actually missiles are going to be involved in it. So it's a very complex story outside of the scope of what I want to share with you this morning, so I'm going to ignore Cuba. But I just mention it now because it is part of the unfolding story, and Cuba is going to end up being the real struggle by 1961, 1962, and 1963. The U-2 flights, whose fragmentary but consistent evidence suggested Khrushchev's missile claims were bluff, were the crucial linchpin in Eisenhower's calculus and not letting the perceived missile gap soften his resistance to Khrushchev's pressures. In short, the intelligence provided by this high-flying techno spy plane was the most important intelligence in the entire U.S. intelligence community. It was the critical intelligence on the Soviet threat and the lengths to which Washington was prepared to go to meet that threat. This makes our Private X a pretty interesting little fellow. His movements in the Far East nicely dovetail with the salient points of the U-2's contribution to the strategic debate in Washington. He was at Atsugi from September through late November 57, a period which precisely overlays the launching of Sputnik and the early active phase of the Soviet ICBM test flight program. His participation in Strong Back led to his knowledge of U-2 operations over China. The same was true of his deployment in Taiwan. The tracks of these Chinese overflights, which Private X personally plotted with his grease pencil, presumably would have given the U.S. valuable intelligence on Chinese military intentions at this crucial juncture. In between the Philippine and Taiwan deployments, he was back at Atsugi. This period, from March to August of 1958, was the period when the Soviet ballistic missile program had ground to a halt. After Taiwan, Private X was back at Atsugi yet again, October through November 1958. These were the exact months leading up to Khrushchev's ultimatum over Berlin. So, while it's true that Private X wasn't in the U-2 program himself, he obviously possessed a great deal of knowledge of U-2 flight activity, which had occurred over Russia during the early ballistic missile test flights and during the subsequent stand-down of their program. This information would have been very, very useful information for the KGB for its assessments of what the Americans had learned of the Soviet capabilities. Private X also possessed knowledge of the U-2's flights over China, obviously, and I don't think I have it in here. I should also say, oh no, I have it here. The U-2 flew 30 penetration flights over Soviet territory between June 56 and May 1960. 2 of those flights occurred after our own Private X defected to the Soviet Union in 1959. The first of those 2 flights on April 9, 1960 was successful, but the second one was shot down. Very interesting. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, survived, and his own analysis leads him to conclude that our own Private X betrayed the height at which U-2 flew. He betrayed to the Soviets. In Power's view, Private X's work with something called the MPS-16, it was a height-finding radar, very advanced at the time, just coming into the Marine inventory, was crucial. And given Private X's extensive knowledge of U-2 operations in Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, the Soviets could be expected to be very interested in him. Therefore, any files after his defection to the Soviet Union should have been very, very carefully examined and stored. This is just the troubling point. I'll tell you what, it isn't surprising that, and this is right out of the new files, that shortly after Francis Gary Powers was shot down in Russia, Atsugi was dismantled. I mean, that says a lot to me right there. What is surprising, however, to me anyway, is that nothing was done about Private X, or so we are told. And the CIA felt that no 201, which is a standard counterintelligence type dossier, was necessary on him. Nobody mentioned his U-2 knowledge at the time of his defection to Moscow. Now, isn't that interesting? How is this possible? This is the heyday of the Cold War. And a Marine, you've seen the advertisements, who has seen little but U-2's defects in the enemy capital, while announcing to the American embassy, stunned American embassy personnel there, that he intends to give up radar secrets and something of special interest? Someone needs to be very upset by this man. But as fate would have it, our Private X was a very special man indeed. He turns up 4 years later in the parade group here in Dallas, Texas. Whether we look at Oswald as a lone nut or a fall guy in the assassination of John Kennedy, we now know that he knew a hell of a lot about the most sensitive program on the planet. And I give you this vignette this morning not to give you any answers in the case, but to, I guess, to make the point that you can connect this story to the larger geostrategic game that was going on. And Oswald was definitely involved in this because of his knowledge. And I'll have more to say on that on Monday night. I'd like to close with on a light note myself, my own joke, and I told this at Copa. It's actually true, but I'll tell it here. One morning I woke up and my wife told me that I had done something funny the evening before, and I said, well, what's that? She said, well, you reached over and touched a certain part of my anatomy and squeezed it, and said to me, nice file, nice file. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, John Newman.
Peter Dale stuff is in your basement with your file?
Yeah.
Too many files.
Well, there are more to come. Okay, we will take questions from the audience, and the way we're going to do it is pretty much the standard procedure. There's a microphone set up right over here. If you will come to the microphone, ask your question of whichever panelist you wish or to the panel in general. And then as soon as you've asked your question, if you'll just return to your seat so that the next person can then ask their question when the panelist is finished. That way we can get in as many as possible in the next 44 minutes. Yes, Jack.
I would like to address this to Mr. Navis. I spoke to him a moment ago, but I want to repeat it so that everyone can hear his answer. He dropped a bombshell on us with his statement that he had a letter from Lee Bowers that said a policeman fired a rifle from behind the fence on the grassy knoll. And I told Al that this needs to be widely publicized or published. And I would like to ask you again to tell the audience what you intend to do with this letter.
Well, I have all of my original correspondence with all of the people with whom I exchanged letters from 1965 through 1973. I have copies of the letters that I would send to them, and then of course I have the originals which they would send to me. I was speaking with John Thunheim, who is the chair of the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, and also David Marwell, their executive director. And I asked them if they would accept my files and put it in the National Archives. They said yes. So that's where they're going to go. I have about 45 file boxes in my garage, which they're not in perfect order, but at least they're all in the correct file folders. They're not necessarily in chronological order, but the Lee Bowers file at least has all of the correspondence. I don't think I'm going to go through it and put it in chronological order. I think that they're getting $2.1 million from the federal government. They might be able to find someone to put it in chronological order. But all of that stuff is going to go into the National Archives.
My name is Hal Verba. I'm from San Francisco. I have a comment to make to Al Navis and a question, and then also a comment for John Newman and a question. Al, you refreshed my memory on an event that you were talking about, Farewell America. I've never discussed this with you, and I've never publicly stated this, but in 1967 and 1968, I got a call from Ramparts magazine, which had done a series of articles on the assassination. And Bill Turner said he had an important and sensitive document that he wished to have delivered to L.A., and I flew down to L.A. and delivered it. He said, please do not read this, and I, of course, followed his instructions. I did not know what that document was, but I found out later after I asked Bill, what was it I delivered down there? He says, oh, this is the manuscript for Farewell America. I don't know if you know this, but the question I want to ask you regarding this is, I then later learned that Herb Lamar had delivered to the garrison staff through one of somebody who had been attached either to garrison staff or who lived in the LA area, that Herb Lamar had delivered a highly generational copy, good quality copy of the Zapruder film. And I want to know if you had any comment on that. And then my question and comment to John Newman, you can answer this. John, I don't know if you're aware of this, and I have mentioned part of what I'm about to say publicly before in previous forums, but what I'm going to say now has new information that I've subsequently discovered on my own. In prior forums, I've mentioned that when Oswald was stationed at Atsugi, he was involved in a very highly sensitive operation that perhaps is even higher than the YouTube program called MITO. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, John. We'll get into that in my comment. I subsequently asked a researcher to get a FOIA request to see if he could find out if there was a MITO. They said there was no such operation that they could release any information on. And I also spoke to a general who was an aide to Kennedy, who said that he did not know of it. However, in Washington, at the recent conference, I there learned that such an operation did exist. I had my own view as to what the initials stood for, and this individual confirmed, yes, that's exactly what those initials stood for, except for one change in one of the initials. Now, John, my question to you is, were you aware of MITO? Are you aware of this operation? And if not, we can discuss this further. It's one of the things I want to discuss with you anyway, but those are my questions and comments. So, Al, you can begin, and John, follow up.
I am familiar with the Ramparts articles. Bill Turner, of course, was, I think, a co-editor of Ramparts magazine back in the 60s. It wasn't I don't think it was a manuscript. I think that you delivered what is in the publishing business called a galley proof, which is usually 8.5 by 11, square bound, typewritten. Typos are in there, spelling mistakes are in there, punctuation things are in there. These are usually given to book reviewers or people who are interested in the case for their comments, which will then appear on the finished copy as reviews, as quotation. If you take a look at a hardcover book, you figure, well, how can they have how can Graham Greene have said what a great book this is when this is the first edition? Well, that's how. They send out advance copies. As far as Hervé Lamar sending a copy of the Zapruder film to Jim Garrison, I can't confirm or deny it. I never had any correspondence with Hervé Lamar. I'd heard about it, but only through other channels. I know that the copy of the Zapruder film that was subpoenaed from Time Life by Garrison, which was shown in the courtroom, was a less than pristine copy, probably a 5th generation print, maybe even a 7th generation print, because the copies that were sitting in the Time Life vaults were 3rds. Of course, the original movie, the film that actually goes through the camera of a color positive film is the 1st generation. But then you have to create a negative off of that to make any prints. So the negative copy of that then becomes a 2nd generation, and it will lose some clarity. The best quality, of course, is going to be the actual Zapruder film, but that is probably a little bit too fragile to continue to be shown, so they make a negative, which is a 2nd generation print, then a positives off of that, which are 3rd generation prints. I think Robert Grodin told me a few years back that there were originally 3 copies that had been made of that print on the night of the assassination, and that he had found out that in reality there were actually 6 copies, that the film technician had made 3 extra copies for himself, because of course he would be in the dark room, the FBI agents would be outside, and it's just a question of, just like a Xerox machine, pressing 6 instead of 3 and running off 3 more prints, and that one of those copies ended up in the hands of Lamar Hunt for a nice little tidy sum, I understand, very shortly after the assassination. But the copy that would have been sent to Garrison would have been a negative and then a positive from that 3rd generation, which would have made it a 5th generation at the very best, and possibly even something worse, because Time Life was in no mood to cooperate with the Garrison investigation. John?
Hal, are you out there? Where is it? METO? METO? Mike Echo Tango Oscar? Okay. No, is the short answer. But I will say that I do have a lot of documents about the JKTO. And I don't know what that means either. I have some guesses about that. And I do know that there's a CIA operation outside of the U2 at Atsugi. And it may be called JTAC, JTEC, and it's handled political actions, probably for the whole theater. I think JKTO is Japan Korea Theater of Operations. That's just a guess. Yeah. It's interesting, the Japanese press just recently was running a big story about these CIA operations in the 50s in Japan. And I mean, I got some calls from Yomiuri Shimbun, and so did others that I know of. Got some calls recently, because what's coming out now is the extent to which the CIA was actually financing and paying the LDP during the early years of its existence. So I don't know. I think we're just beginning to learn a lot about the CIA assets in Atsugi and elsewhere over there. For me to get into this in this book that's coming out, as I'm really up against the wall, I would have to have a documentary trail to include it. So I'm interested in talking to you later about it.
At one point, the general who was named Kennedy happened to have been in Atsugi, was with the CIA. He did not know about it.
Well, it could be that he just has maybe the letters wrong. We'll talk later. This is too haphazard. Sorry.
Okay. Yes, sir.
May I ask John 2 questions? First, is it your opinion that the U-2 was shot down or sabotaged with explosives?
Well, I don't have an opinion on that. Well, let me answer your question this way. There's a book by Michael Beschloss, about this, maybe just about the U-2. In any event, in the back of this book, and I don't believe it's the Kennedy-Khrushchev years, but anyway, Michael Beschloss is an historian. And in the back of one of his books is a transcript of Eisenhower and John McCone, who was the CIA director after Allen Dulles was fired. And Eisenhower was engaged in writing his memoirs, Waging Peace, at the time. And he was dealing with the U-2 problem. And he was very angry at having, Eisenhower lied publicly. I don't know whether you know that. He denied that we had anything to do with that U-2 when it went down. And he had been assured that Powers the plane would have blown up and Powers would have committed suicide and so on. So he was told, don't worry, there'll be no evidence. And so he lied, and he got caught. And he was very upset about that. And there's this long discussion in the transcript which relates to your question about whether the thing was blown up and how it was blown up. And one possibility may have been that they shot a lot of missiles and exploded them in the vicinity, and they got it that way. But I don't think anyone really knows definitively the answer, so that's as much as I can tell you about that. Oh, the book is Mayday by Beschloss?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
How
It
about
has an interesting transcript in the back of it.
How about your thoughts on whether Oswald's mission was to leak just enough information to have it brought down to forestall detente, or whether he was sincerely co-opted and had
See,
really...
that's a tremendous leap. Did everyone hear the question? Was Oswald there to leak information about the U-2? And, I don't have an opinion on that because the evidence is too fragmentary. Certainly, it's consistent. One can argue that case. I could argue that case. You just phrased the question. I think what I'm going to end up arguing in my book is that his whole file in this period, he looks like a spy. He walks like a spy. He talks like a spy. He probably was, at least in his own mind. The files are incomplete. There's a lot of things still classified. Was it the U-2? If he was it the U-2 mission? Francis Gary Powers thinks so. I'll tell you somebody else who's commented on this publicly is Richard Snyder, the American consul, and he thought that what Oswald meant when he said, I'm going to give up radar secrets and something of special interest, was the U-2. He's guessing. So, in accordance with my comments last night, I don't want to guess.
It would make sense that it was his mission, except that they did change their codes at Atsugi afterwards.
Yeah, and a lot more. Now, this is for naval air. This is not the U-2. This is for, he compromised call signs and frequencies and so on. So, yes, our entire operations were affected by that.
Thanks.
Sure.
James Johnston from Wichita, Kansas. I have an observation on Mr. Griggs' experience laboring with his volumes of the Warren Report, and then I have a question for John Newman. I don't know how many people in the audience know. I did not know until several years ago when I began my research that there are copies of the Warren Commission reports, all 26 appendices and the report, in every university which is denominated a United States government depository. I was amazed to find out that Wichita State University is a United States government depository, and all of the Warren appendices and report is on file in our university library in Wichita, Kansas, which is a city of about 280,000 people. So I would suggest that some of the researchers out there may want to check out to see if your little local university is a United States government depository, because if it is, the Warren Report and its appendices are probably there. Interesting. My question to John Newman is this. Are you familiar with the article co-authored by John Galbraith that appeared in the American Prospect magazine for this fall, having to do with President Kennedy's reaction to the military and the CIA intelligence reports when national intelligence estimates were being presented to him for the first time in 1961. These, as I understand it, these intelligence estimates had been annually given to President Eisenhower and were centered, of course, on the missile gap and the missile relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States. This is an extremely interesting article that Galbraith claims it's based on a newly released document, not necessarily an assassination document. Are you familiar with that article?
Yes. Can I rephrase that question?
Yes.
For the benefit of the audience?
Yes. I think
we know about this article by Jamie Galbraith Jr. What's it about, and what's my opinion of it?
Yes.
And yes, I'm aware of it. It's a very interesting article. In fact, the source we're talking about is Howard Burris. For those of you who read my JFK in Vietnam, you know Howard figures very prominently in that. He was LBJ's military aide. And what we're talking about here is another Burris memo. A lot of it's been blacked out. That article is about planning in the United States for a first strike against the Soviet Union. And it is an extraordinary article. It was something called the Net Evaluation Group, and we're learning about it for the first time from new documents that the LBJ Library up here in Austin, that's where the information is coming from, the LBJ Library. If you're interested here, check out something we call this the Vice Presidential Security File. And a lot of people overlook this. There is a Vice Presidential file that has information on a number of issues. I got a lot of my stuff out of the LBJ Library up here, out of that very archive. In any event, this article by Jamie Galbraith Jr., son of the John Galbraith Sr., very famous U.S. official during the Kennedy administration, before and after, actually, wrote an article about this document and other research he did, along with Heather Purcell, who's right up here at UT. And they advanced the argument that we were very seriously considering a first strike against the Soviet Union. And actually, I like your question because it fits in exactly with what I was talking about earlier, only it's where the story goes after the part that I told you here today. Eisenhower did, in fact, speed up the United States ballistic missile program as a result of all those events and the fears I described, the missile bluff and the gap and so on. And therefore, we were deploying a number of these ballistic missiles in a few short years. And guess when they came online? Over the course of 1960. And John Kennedy came in as president when we had literally a tremendous capability just coming into our hands. And the satellites to see, to verify what the U-2 only hinted at, that they didn't have it. And what we're talking about here is a very unstable period in the history of U.S.-Soviet strategic relations. There are only two periods like this. One is right here in the John Kennedy years, and the other period is in the Reagan years, or let's just say, instead of Reagan, let's say the end of the 70s and the early 80s. And in both instances, one side had a significant advantage over the other side in strategic programs. In the case we're talking about, and the question that you've asked about in Galbraith's article, what we're talking about is a period where the United States had the advantage, a very huge advantage. And I analyze the entire panoply of foreign policy issues here. That would be Laos, Vietnam, Cuba, Berlin, where the United States is very aggressive with the Russians, wants to roll them back everywhere. And in fact, there were advocates of a first strike while we had the opportunity. One of the people who advocated this is Curtis LeMay. And if you're interested in just how serious he was about that, read I forget which chapter it is in JFK in Vietnam. It's in the beginning of the book, which deals with the Laos crisis and how, even though LeMay didn't think the Chinese would come in, he wanted to nuke them anyway and bring them in. And yeah, it is a bit funny. I mean, it's a bit surrealistic to think about it, that people were serious about this. But the article that you've mentioned is the first time that this has been written up, actually and it's a respected journal. It's very, very interesting. And yet I knew about it. I know Jamie, and I knew about this document, and it's very integral to what I'll be doing with Kennedy and Cuba. I'm sorry it took so long to answer that question, but it's an important one, I think.
May I make one other observation on that article? It is interesting to ponder that the national intelligence estimates indicated that the most favorable time, i.e. the greatest gap in favor of the United States to make a preemptive strike would have been in the fall of 1963.
Thank you.
I just want to interject something here about the Warren Report versus the 26 volumes of exhibits and testimonies. As you probably are aware, it's very easy to get a copy of the Warren Report in its original blue cloth binding. There were about 2.5 million copies published by the United States Government Printing Office. As far as the 26 volumes, the print run was only 6,420, and the government only provided sales records for 2,980. So that obviously asks the question, where are the rest of them? And it sort of, to me, brings to mind the last scene of the first of the Indiana Jones movies, where you have this cavernous warehouse somewhere in upper Knee Jerk, Wyoming or something like this, with just nothing but piles and piles of unused, unopened sets of the exhibits and testimonies. And I think the reason they did so few of these, they were only $76 a set in 1964 when they were put on sale. It's also the only government report that was published without an index, and this was done obviously on purpose. Right now, if anyone asks me as a bookseller, can I get you a set of 26 volumes, I say it'll cost you about $1,500 to $2,000, and since both the 26 volumes and the 12 volumes of the exhibits and testimonies of the House Assassination are both coming out on CD-ROM, that $1,500 to $2,000 will buy you both of those CD-ROMs and a computer, which, gall darn it, you can use for other things. And with CD-ROM instant search capability, you don't need to try and find Sylvia Maher's index, which is also impossible to find. So if any of you people are looking for sets, invest in the CD-ROM. They're fantastic. Thanks, Bob.
Thanks, Al. I'll speak to the books.
Can I just intrude and ask if any of you has a question for Frank? Because if you don't, I do. And Frank, I don't mean to put you, I'm going to just ask Frank, if you don't mind, this question. And I don't want to put, it's not to put you on the spot at all, because you may know nothing about this, but I'm curious if you do have an opinion on the Lumumba assassination. I mean, are you familiar with this? Could you give us your perspective if you do have one?
Yeah, I don't think I have, much about the assassination itself, but what I was saying is the impact, what, foreign countries, how they felt it, and what it did to the, different countries overseas. And some individuals who might have been tracking the record personally, would like to write more books on that. They've visited this place, they've got some input, some news about it, and they would like to put. But due to the government or the place they are, they can't even, bring it across to publish it.
The reason why I asked the question, we're learning from these files that Lumumba was the target of ZR rifle, one of the first targets, and the CIA claims not, well, they wanted to, but they were not successful. Somebody else was. I was curious if you could tell us anything about.
On that one, you're talking of when I was 11 years. That was in 1957. Okay, Patrice Lumumba was killed, and in fact his killing, as we believe now, has some impact in what is going on.
Is there a feeling today that the CIA was involved in that, or was it internal?
Well, I won't speak for the Congos, I'm from Nigeria.
Right.
So I don't know what is their feeling about that now.
Yes, this is a question for John. I've been trying to put together a time chronology of Lee Harvey Oswald during certain periods of 57, and you've done excellent job in a certain time period. But I didn't hear the part about his location around October 10th through the 15th of 57. Was that part of your listing chronology, or can you recall from memory?
Well, first of all, he gets there, and as I said, September, right after or before Sputnik, and the deployment to the Philippines is at the end of the year. So, I mean, I have to sit down with you. I have the entire chronology now to see exactly. I have the date that the ship leaves and when they come back, and so on. Is there a specific thing that you're interested in?
Yeah, I'll ask the other two parts, and then I'll tell everybody what the specific thing is. Was there any period of hospitalization or incarceration of Oswald?
And I don't deal with that right now because it doesn't really get me into the material. For me, the reason why I'm dealing with the U-2, incidentally, is because the lack of any investigation of Oswald when he defects.
Okay.
It's very important. Now, if we can tie him to the JFK or any other program over there, that's fine too. The problem is I need hard facts. I need documents. I know. And I'm well aware of the shooting incident and
what was that? I'm not even aware. Did anybody else here know?
Yeah, sure. The story is that Oswald, inflicted this wound. It was a self-inflicted wound, so he could get away and talk to his agent handlers, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, that's the conspiratorial, possibility that he do that.
So what was the date and approximately how long was he in the hospital? Can anybody help me with that? What was the date of the self-inflicted gunshot wound and how long was he hospitalized? It was summer or fall of 57? All right. Well, it'd be fun to know it today.
No, it's a matter of record. I mean, it's in his records. Okay. Exactly the date.
All right. I'm sorry? Okay. And third question is the meeting in Taiwan of the Asian People's Anti-Communist League. I had that as November of 57. Maybe Dick Russell can tell us if he's still here. I think just disappeared. Does anybody know that date? And I'll tell you why all three may be linked. No way. All right. Basically, the reason I'm interested in those dates is that two very close associates and friends of Spaz T. Riken met their unfortunate and untimely demise in I think, dates of mysterious disappearances where Oswald's whereabouts are not very well known. One was October the 15th of 1959. Professor Stefan Bandera died in West Germany at the hands of the Minsk assassin Bogdan Stashinsky. And now I'm focusing on the first death of a friend of Spaz T. Riken's on October the 12th of 57, also at the hands of Bogdan Stashinsky. And where I'm trying to go with this is that the period of hospitalization and incarceration could also have been a period of indoctrination or programmed assassin, indoctrination for Oswald. And literally, as silly as this may sound, the meeting of the Taiwanese Asian People's Anti-Communist meeting has been suggested to me by a source who should know that literally one of the items on the docket was a Manchurian candidate type of demonstration and discussion, also in 1157. So it may go there. Do you think there's any possibility of linking those three events together?
Without documents, I would never do a thing like that.
Okay.
It's interesting, as all the details of Oswald's past are interesting.
Okay, but obviously everybody would prefer the documentation. So.
Well, yeah, or the source. I'd need to know who they are. We didn't want to talk to them. I mean, there's. I just can't tell you how important it is to have a conservative methodology.
I understand.
And not to guess or not to advance a theory without enough substance. So let's just say you're in the research stage at this point with this material and accumulating data, and then see how it works out. You have to sort out, I mean, I would sort out what is anecdotal and what is documentary, at least for the time being.
Sure.
This is sort of a natural follow-up to that. My question is for Dr. or Major Newman. I agree with what you've told us about Oswald's relationship to the U-2, but as you know, Gerald Posner has questioned whether there's any hard evidence of Oswald having had any real knowledge of the U-2 other than the after-the-fact stories told by Lieutenant Donovan and specifically at QB Point. My question is, do you have any documentable evidence of his having watched radar blips or whatever at QB Point or anything else connected to the U-2?
Sure, I was reading from the Detachment C history. Of course, they don't mention Oswald's name because the Marines were not in Detachment C, but we now have hard facts. We know where those U-2s were, and it's interesting to look at what the CIA has released. So we know that physically he is there. We know where his barracks were. It was on the runway, right? Not on, but next to the runway. They take off, they land, they see them. The pilots jump out, they throw black sheets over their head, they go into the club and they talk to them at night. The pilots say, oh, we're just doing local reconnaissance. We have a lot of documents about that. We know also, for example, that Oswald's unit at Kubi Point was, the patrol duty they were pulling was to guard the hangar. So we do know some facts from documents.
Yeah.
At least enough to get me interested to actually write about this, because I know I've got enough to get started.
And circumstantial evidence is evidence, but what I wanted to know, is there anything directly?
Oh yes, there is, but it's not convincing, but it's enough to take this very seriously and get started with it. So I've written a whole chapter. In fact, well, since you've asked me, let me just tell you, these documents do have one error in them. There's a special classification for the U-2 program, and it was above top secret. They've left the top secret on all these documents, but you can see clearly a redaction. It's white, it's neatly done, but you can see it. It's missing in every page except one page. At the very end of the document, somebody screwed up. And it says in big capital letters, Eider Chess. And that's my chapter 3, top secret Eider Chess. And we know a lot more about it now. We know that Oswald's unit knew a lot about it. They talked to those pilots, they tracked those planes. In fact, it's interesting that at that time, planes were not thought to be able to go above 60,000 feet or so, approximately. And the U-2 pilots would call in to the Marine unit as they hit 60,000 feet and check in. And then as they were leaving at 80 and 100,000 feet, say sayonara, just to impress, wow, the Marines in their little radar bubble down there. There isn't any question about this, that Oswald's unit was very, very involved, had to be by their physical location.
Well, I can't wait for your book. Thank you.
Mr. Newman, you related to us the story of how the Soviets had engaged in strategic deception to
Maskarova.
To convince us that they were strong when they were really weak. Could our whole U-2 program have represented a strategic deception to cover the fact that we knew the inside details, but we had to have a way to cover our knowledge?
Well, but you have to understand what the U-2 is. It's a plane that it's a platform, and then it's got cameras on it. So it can't do anything except take pictures or intercept signals, and it can't do any cover-up. Now, what people do with the intelligence, that you can package that into it, but the U-2 itself can't be anything to cover up. In fact, I really believe, just what I told you, that the U-2 was crucial to get out and take a look at those impact areas. Without the U-2, you couldn't know whether any of those shots were successful. And I certainly wouldn't have wanted to bank American lives and nuclear war, on a human report out of Russia. I didn't want photographs.
You would think that spy tale would be more important than human tale.
It's another int, and you have to consider all the ints, humint, sigint, imint, and the most convincing thing, the most convincing int in a ballistic missile test program is going to be photographic coverage of those impact areas, along with the radar emissions at takeoff and during the, the telemetry is important too.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Newman, I'd like to address this question to you. You mentioned that you're researching into Oswald's defection. Will you also be researching into how he got back into the United States? Because I feel this is a very important area that doesn't seem to be, or hasn't seemed to have been covered specifically to explain how he got back in and why no one's really come forward and well, basically explain.
What's your name, sir?
Stephen Morley.
And you came from England?
I did, yeah.
Welcome. I'm glad that you traveled all this way, Stephen. And it's a very incisive question. It just drove me crazy. I don't mean this as a criticism, but all the books that we have on this subject don't do justice to 1960, 1961, 1962. Part of it, I suppose, has been the documents haven't been there, but there has been. If you look at those 26 volumes, there's a lot of material in there on this period. It's tough. It is tough to understand the 4 and 5 little compartments in the State Department that are dealing with this problem. And we're talking about State Department security, I would add there, and the CIA, and the FBI, and the ONI, and believe it or not, Air Force intelligence. Peter Dale Scott and I tore our hair out for 2 straight weeks in my basement, trying to tack together the complicated story of his, not just the return, but dealing with what had he expatriated himself or not, because this affected whether or not he could come back in. And the entire panoply of issues is very difficult. We did it. And I think the answer is, if I could just use a soundbite, if I were on Bryant Gumbel's Good Morning, Today Show, there you go, somebody lifted the gate.
Do you think that had some of the earlier researchers investigated this, say, 20 years ago, or spent more time in that particular area of Oswald's return, we may well have learned more about why or how he got back into the country?
Absolutely. Excuse me. I'm very interested to see what happens this spring. I mean, my own book is rather narrow. It's focused on his internal files, but you've got Norman Mailer, who spent a lot of time over there in Minsk, and David Lifton. Everybody's sort of screaming towards this deadline. We should have a nice melee about this issue around about April or May of next year. Thank you very much.
Can I just take one minute?
Just dealing briefly with the actual defection, the journey of Oswald between this country and the Soviet Union. Part of the research that's going on in England at the moment with one particular guy is doing this. He's researching the stopover in England, methods of travel, dates, times, etc. And I've got to say this, he's already dug up a lot of information that appears to have escaped researchers on this side of the Atlantic. He's also established that a lot of the so-called facts published about this period on this side of the Atlantic are in error. He's been in touch with the hotel in Finland, he's been in touch with the airlines, he's getting timetables and he's trying to speak to fellow passengers. Hopefully this will be developed over the next few months and hopefully will be edited, written up and published probably in the 4th decade. So Stephen, there may be something here for you. Just keep watching 4th decade next year. Thank you.
Is there somebody in the audience here who told me the story about Marina's latest comment on the Helsinki trip? Well, that's too bad. It's very interesting. Apparently, she claims Oswald said now he took a hop. A hop, yeah. A military hop. Do you know this?
I know a little bit about this. I think she says it was a military hop. This is based mainly on the fact that he was wearing what appears to have been some sort of military uniform. And he wouldn't have got on a military plane without this. We know that he had a certain pass, ID card, that would not have been available to a bona fide civilian. This would indicate some sort of intelligence connection. And Marina has now stated that she recalls, I think it was some sort of raincoat that he wore, which was a military issue thing, and he obviously wouldn't have got on a military flight without this. This slightly goes against what my colleague in England is working on. These are directly opposite views, but it's certainly a valid point. And Marina, I don't know why Marina's not come up with this before, but she's been talking about this for the last few months. We'll wait and see.
Okay, this will be our last question. Yes, sir.
This is directed to Mr. Newman here. It's a pleasure. Just some comments and thoughts, maybe. I'm aware of the 56, late 56 of the first strike. I read it somewhere. But during the Cuban situation, where the missiles were deployed, my understanding, and of course, at that time I was old enough to fight, and would have, because I can remember the ships coming to the quarantine line, and we were listening to it, and were very angry.
You were in the Navy at the time?
No, I was just a civilian, and just barely old enough to get into the military. And I know that the fellows that I was with, a number of them are no longer with us as a result of NOM. The point I want to make is John Kennedy was aware that there were missiles or equipment coming into Cuba long before October of '62.
The answer to that is yes.
Why did he allow that, in your opinion?
Did he allow what?
This to go on until he was forced in October of '62 to deal with it.
Right, let's rephrase the question for clarity here. The question on the floor right now is, was there awareness prior to the summer of 1962 of those Soviet missiles in Cuba? And the answer is yes. And if that's true, what is this story then of Kennedy being surprised, the American public being surprised by these photographs of these missiles? And the answer I would give you is that it's part of a political struggle. And that article that somebody mentioned or asked about earlier, I think is very much a part of this story. And I think that what we're going to find, and this is early on for me, but if I were to answer you now how this looks or may look in the chapters that are going to be covering that period, it looks to me like this was a pressure tactic to provoke a confrontation. I'm very concerned that some people may have even wished it to escalate. If I could just, in closing, because it is time to finish up, say that we have learned something about, not exactly the question you posed, earlier knowledge of the missiles, but that's coming out, not just what I'm going to do. I know a very fine doctoral dissertation that has examined this and will argue, I think, persuasively of earlier knowledge. But something that has fallen out of the American, Cuban, Russian retrospective discussions on the Cuban Missile Crisis is very extraordinary. And the Americans didn't know this at the time and were shocked. McNamara was one of the people, and Schlesinger was another one of the people representing America in these discussions. The Americans were absolutely shocked to find out that the Soviet commander in Cuba had authorization to fire those missiles if the United States attacked by air or land. And those, it's interesting in retrospect now to know that Kennedy was given all these options, all of which included an American attack, except for the one he picked, which is to set up that blockade. And had any other option been chosen, this city might have been incinerated.
There's no doubt. The last and final question is the statements that were made that not all the missiles were ever removed from Cuba. And that was the last one I wanted to say.
Yeah, I don't know what the state of the evidence is on that. I know there's a lot of controversy about that. It's part of our story, as a matter of fact. How many people have heard of the so-called bio-poly mission? A number of you. Hinkle and Turner wrote about it. It's in a lot of books. Gayton's written about it. Peter Scott's written about it. These new files that we're looking at now have the CIA report, the wrap-up of the bio-poly mission. It wasn't the actual name of it was Operation Tilt, and apparently to exfiltrate 4, not 2. Hinkle and Turner thought it was 2. It's 4 Soviet officers, intelligence officers, from a missile base that was still supposed to be there after they were supposed to have been taken out.
I'm aware of that.
Whether it's true or not, I'm not sure. But and of course, this Tilt mission failed. They never came back. So there is a lot of new information on that, and it may be that not all of them were taken out. I think we're going to have to wrap it up.
I thank you for your thoughts.
You're welcome, sir. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks very much.
We'll see you at 2 o'clock.
Could I ask the members of the medical panel who are here in the room to come forward? People who are speaking on the medical panel at 2 o'clock to come forward, if there's anyone in the room.
Thank you very much. Appreciate now. Very, how you were on the first.
Look for it. I could not find it, but recently they sent me a little flyer somewhere new.
Are you ready?
Of course not. Scary. I know some people are worried.
Thank you very much. We're happy to be with you today, happy that you're with us, and we apologize for a brief delay in getting started. My name is Dave Tucker. I'll be the moderator for today. We have some very interesting panelists. Gary Aguilar, who has the published response to the Hume's Boswell assertions about the John F. Kennedy assassination. There's all sorts of interesting things to take place during his presentation. Number 2, we have Joseph Riley, a neurosciences person, and that should be self-explanatory. Wallace Milam is our 3rd speaker, and Philip T. Brink will be our 4th. First of all, I'd like to ask each panelist, if you would please just give us a quick 60 to 2-minute rundown on what you've been doing. Started off with Mr. Gary Aguilar, please.
I'm Gary Aguilar. I'm a practicing ophthalmologist in San Francisco, and have had an interest in the assassination, not a very active interest in the late 60s and early 70s, and I will admit that Oliver Stone's movie rekindled my interest when the Journal of American Medical Association published some letters by the some interviews with the autopsy pathologist to pique my curiosity. I wrote them a letter, which was published. My letter, along with that of David Mantix, Patricia James, Anthony White's, Wayne Smith's, and several others, were published, and in a very peculiar reversal of the canon of the customary scientific protocol, there was no answer given by the people to whom the letter was directed to, the autopsy pathologists. Very peculiarly, in a subsequent issue, many months later, Robert Artwald attempted, I think inadequately, to answer many of the questions that we had raised. We as a group found one another, and I wrote a multi-author letter to the Journal of American Medical Association, basically asking the questions of them again that had been ignored the first time through. And I got a very curt reply from the Journal of American Medical Association refusing to publish that, indicating that they had, quote, already published our views. Well, they had not. They had published our questions. Their questions were not views, they were questions, and they went unanswered, and remain unanswered to this day. Nevertheless, I continued to follow the case, became even more knowledgeable and studied more about the medical evidence and what had been said before and during and since. Spoke to J. Thornton Boswell myself, called him on the phone, asked him some information which I'll be sharing with you today, and had a letter published in the in the Columbia Journalism Review raising questions about the terrible work the Journal of American Medical Association had done, and also had a letter published in the Federal Bar News and Journal, a copy of which is in the 4th decade, raising questions about what Mr. Posner has said about the autopsy pathologist and alleged interviews he had with them. In any case, I am representing some of the interests of people who cannot be here today, such as David Mantic, a physicist who is also a physician, PhD physicist who is also a physician, and a couple of other witnesses, David Narrow specifically, and Brad Parker. In any case, Joe Riley.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Gary. Wallace Milam will be our 2nd president. Joe Riley? Joe Riley, pardon me. Joe, give us a little bit of your background, please.
We've done a little round robin up here,
Yes.
schedule rearranging and arranging, so we're very
My training is as a neuroscientist, meaning that neuroanatomy and experimental neuropathology. One of my duties was to teach neuroanatomy to medical students and to pathology residents, so I'm not overly impressed with the amount of knowledge they have. To keep a long story short, the best summary I can give you of what I'll be talking about is in a handout. There's some in the back and there's some up front, and before I start into my spiel, grab a handout and that will give you a pretty much an overview.
Okay, our third speaker will be Wallace Milam. Wallace.
I can tell right off that Mr. Riley's new to these proceedings. Never mention the word handout when people would ask. I learned that the hard way a few years ago. While the people are gathering up, I will say that my name is Wallace Milam. I'm in the usual position of being the only non-medical person on the medical panel. I'm an American history teacher. I have been, I think, on every A.S.K. medical panel since we started having them. And I will be speaking today about neutron activation analysis, Dr. Vincent Gwynn's very key testimony before the House Assassinations Committee, in which he gave evidence which, if valid, supported the single bullet theory. And Dr. Gwynn, in his appearance before the House Assassinations Committee, stated that fragments taken from Governor Connolly's wrist matched, from the standpoint of their chemical composition, fragments found in the bullet, or fragments which he took from the famous stretcher bullet CE-399, therefore giving a scientific underpinning to the single bullet theory. And I will be speaking about Dr. Gwynn's work today.
Thank you, Mr. Milam. Philip T. Brink is also with us. This man has been working in emergency rooms for an extended period of time. He has seen many gunshot wounds to all parts of the abdomen, the head, you name it, he's seen it. He'll be our fourth one. Let's start off with Mr. Aguilar, please, if you don't mind.
You want to say something about yourself?
No.
I think that I would like to go begin the presentation essentially recounting some of the medical evidence as we have it in the literature on the assassination. The idea here will be to refresh all of our memories, including my own, of course, about what was said about these wounds, with an idea being to try to make an understanding of the complexities of the case a little easier, and some of the current status of the disputes in this case, because it is not as simple as most people think. I will say at the outset that many of you have probably read in various and sundry places that the x-rays show the front part of the bone and the front part of the head up here, the frontal bone missing. I've seen the original autopsy materials, and that's not accurate. What happens is the whiteness of the x-ray tends to be an additive effect, and when you have bone in front and in back, the x-ray shows it very white. When you have bone missing someplace, the x-ray shows it darker. The bone is missing more in back than in front, and therefore this looks darker in the area of the front, but actually on the original x-rays you can see the frontal sinuses and you can see the frontal bone there, and you can also see it on the lateral film. I'll have some observations with regard to David Mantick's interpretation of those x-rays at the end of the presentation. But just to bring us up to speed, this is what the autopsy report described, and I have a skull here to try to hold out to show you what they're talking about. There is an irregular defect of the scalp and skull on the right involving chiefly the parietal bone, which is this bone up here, but extending somewhat into the temporal, this bone here, and occipital regions. In this region there is an actual absence of scalp and bone, producing a defect which measures approximately 13 centimeters in greatest diameter. 13 centimeters is about the width across the palm of an average man's hand. Mine's about 12.5 to 13, and that's about what you can expect. So let us take the palm of our hands and imagine a defect that would involve the parietal bone and extend into the temporal and occipital regions, and if we had such a defect, it would have to be here, would it not? right rear quadrant of the head. If we were to look at the head like a cube, we would say that it involved the right rear quadrant of the head because it extended into the temporal area, which is inferior, extended into the occipital area, which is in the rear, and of course chiefly involved the parietal bone, which, as I mentioned before, is toward the top of the skull. The parietal bone, in fact, extends all the way here. Now, this is the autopsy diagram prepared by an artist named Rydberg under the direction of the autopsy pathologist, indicating the defect as they portrayed it. And you'll see that they have Kennedy's head tilted very far forward to show that the defect essentially started in this location up here, but that there was an entrance wound where it says in that arrow down here, and they pointed to a skull. And the defect, they're describing it as thus. So a little bit more anterior than what you would intuitively guess by their autopsy description. Now, this is a diagram prepared by McClellan, which first appeared in 6 Seconds in Dallas by Tink Thompson. And in this image of it, which is copied from my own version of it, that's my thumb up top here, there is a letter written by Paul Peters, who I heard speak on the subject of Kennedy's assassination, where he indicates his agreement with this diagram, indicating that the major defect of the skull that he saw at Parkland Hospital was in the rear of the skull, right? And essentially very far rearward. The ear would be sticking out of this canal here, and you can see that with respect to that diagram, the defect did extend down that low that it would be looking at the head straight on from the back, that you would have this portion of the head missing as they examined it. There was a controversy. Now, the autopsy pathologist labeled the skull for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and you can see here in this diagram, or in this skull, that's the external occipital protuberance, that little knob right there, which on this skull you can see is the central dot here. And they labeled these spots. There was a spot labeled here, a spot labeled here, and a spot labeled here, and that's where the 3 different autopsy pathologists placed the entrance wound. Well, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, as well as the forensic group that was assembled for the Rockefeller Commission, decided on the basis of photographs and evidence that they'd missed the wound, that the wound was not down here, but it was up here. Now, I don't believe there is a person in this room likely to have ever made such an error, and there probably isn't a pathologist in the group of you. I think that this is the kind of error that a first-year forensic pathology resident would have been canned for residency for having made, and he would have been canned by someone like Dr. Fink, who taught residents, as did Dr. Humes and Boswell. So, but let us assume, because of the work of David Lifton's book, Best Evidence, that the photographs and x-rays are authentic, complete, and reliable. These physicians must have made an error in that case. Now, this is a diagram prepared contemporaneously on the night of the autopsy. It is the only, quote, notes, unquote, that made it into the final record, although there's reason to suspect, which I will not dwell upon here today, that there may be other notes that were taken that survived a burning that were not part of the record ultimately and have since disappeared. But this was the autopsy face sheet prepared by Dr. Boswell on the night of the autopsy. I'll draw your attention to 2 numbers here. The number under this is a numerator of 3 and a denominator of 6. I don't know if I show that again to prove that that is actually a 6, but it is clearly a 6, and we've seen it in big blow-ups. And also there is the number 17 here with the word missing there. Now, before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, to Harrison Livingston, and to me in a phone conversation of March 30th, 1994, Dr. Boswell said to all 3 of us that 17 centimeters was the area that was missing at the time of the assassinations. Now, I do have it, and you can see that that clearly is a 6. There's the missing, and that there was a fragment of bone 6 centimeters below the area of the defect. Well, when you look at a skull, it is very convenient, and we might even want to turn all these lights off unless people are foolish enough to be taking notes on what I'm saying. Wouldn't want to do that, would you? Down, the other way. So everybody can go to sleep. Yeah, it's after lunch, remember.
Thank you.
Now, the very peculiar thing about this, if 17 centimeters was missing at the time of the assassination and from the skull, I took this skull, which I have here in my hand, and took a measurement. And I measured 17 centimeters from the most anterior location the defect could have been. Jack Kennedy, who was my age at the time of his death, my very age today, 46, was lucky enough to have a lower hairline than I do. But if the defect in the skull extended as low as the point I'm putting here, which is 4 centimeters above the supraorbital ridge, and you measure backward from that position, you are spot on the external occipital protuberance. This higher location is about 13.5 centimeters behind the most anterior location the defect could have extended. So in the respect that he put 17 centimeters on a face sheet diagram, he basically is indicating that that defect went well back into the rear of the skull. The fact that he also put 6 centimeters down there is relevant as well. This is a measurement taken from the lowest portion of the skull underneath the external occipital protuberance, which is called the foramen magnum. And the foramen magnum is the opening through which the spinal cord runs. Dr. Riley understands this much better than I do, but as I understand it from my neuroanatomy friends, that's what happens at that hole there. In any case, 6 centimeters directly above the external occipital protuberance, and where are you? Spot on, or 6 centimeters above the foramen magnum, you are again spot on the external occipital protuberance. So in a way, the autopsy pathologist verbally said that the wound was very near the external occipital protuberance. He put 2 numbers on the autopsy face sheet prepared on the night of the autopsy, and therefore, because they're so close to the event itself, and they're contemporaneous, more reliable, he has essentially biangulated this wound right to that location accurately. How could they be wrong? It is a mystery, isn't it? Now, here is a diagram drawing by Paul O'Connor, which many people who are convinced that these fellows made a mistake and the wound is much higher, many apologists of the Warren Commission have scoffed at this diagram that indicates a defect that extended well back into the back of the head here. Here is what we're talking about this is prepared by Doug DeSalles, a very nice comparison image showing the external occipital protuberance where they indicated it was in their autopsy diagram, where they testified to it before the Warren Commission, where they again testified to it before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, where they insisted to the Journal of the American Medical Association in interviews published in May of 1992, and where Boswell again told me in March 30th of this year that the wound was down there, the entrance wound was down there. But they were forced before the House Select Committee on Assassinations to look at this photograph, and this is a diagram of the photograph. The photograph is far less clear, as we'll see, indicating that no, the defect, the wound of entrance had to be way up high in the skull, and that there was no defect in the back of the scalp here, as so many people at Parkland Hospital have said there was. Now, they looked at that image of the photograph, and they were asked, does this not go backwards? All the way to the right, I see, okay. They were asked about this wound. Now, you'll have to take my word for it in a minute, and I'll prove it in a few minutes when I show the actual photograph. This is a diagram of the Ida Doc's. This is Ida Doc's drawing a diagram of the photograph. And she has greatly emphasized or exaggerated the prominence of that object there to make it more easy to interpret it as an entrance wound. But here who's looking at the actual photograph said to the House Select Committee on Assassinations that upper, whatever it is, that was a wound. He was pointing the lower object, and the wound on the skull precisely coincided with it. I can assure you that as we reflected the scalp to get to this point, there was no defect corresponding to this, the higher wound, in the skull at any point. He was very strongly opposing the notion that the wound was high in the skull. I don't know what it is, that little spot up there. It could be to me clotted blood. I don't know. I don't know what it was, but it certainly was not any wound of entrance. So you have the autopsy pathologist disputing very forcefully, and Humes and Boswell and Fink all disputed this. Now, I will admit, because it's true, that Humes, in the third of 3 interviews on this, and probably there were private conversations for which we have no records, essentially caved in and said, well, maybe the photograph's misrepresented, and maybe that is somewhat of a wound, but clearly I don't think that he ever believed that, and Boswell told me, as we'll see later on, you have to take his, what he said about that wound with a grain of salt. Anything he said after the autopsy, he said, because he reaffirmed the location of the wound being low to the Journal of the American Medical Association. Nevertheless, the House Select Committee on Assassination, Dr. Fink believes strongly that the observations of the autopsy pathologists were more valid than those of individuals who might subsequently examine photographs, and we might all agree they had the body in their hands. This is what he was arguing was an entrance wound, and this is, you can see how imperceptible the defect was that he was asked to identify as an entrance wound by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He was convinced that that was not true. Now, I want to just kind of bring everyone into this, so I'm going to go and just kind of, not very objectively, present the evidence, and then go into some things which I think are very interesting. Here again is the drawing the Rydberg diagram showing the defect in the skull. Now, at the top here you see what John Latimer decided. Now, Dr. Latimer was having to kind of move things forward again because despite the fact that the autopsy report described the defect being parietal, occipital, and temporal, he now really wanted to make it more parietal and frontal and temporal. And in fact, one of the other physician who is a Warren Commission apologist, Robert Artwell, has called the defect anterolateral in a television appearance on the American Medical Association's AMA News. And he went out and shot up some skulls, and he demonstrated quite convincingly that if you hit the skull at the top point up here, that it blows out the front of the skull, just like Kennedy's. But of course, if that's where the defect is, if the defect is more or less like that in the front of the skull, it is astonishing indeed that the defect would have been described by Parkland doctors as well as Bethesda doctors as being parietal, occipital, and temporal. Nevertheless, and in fact we have good reason to think that that's what it was not like at all. Now, there has been a lot of confusion about this, and I think that I would like to lay a lot of the blame of the confusion to Dr. Hume's feet. Dr. Humes told the Warren Commission that the wound was just to the right and above, or to the right and just above the external occipital protuberance. Again, that little knob which you can feel at the base of your own skull. Put your hand back there. There's a little knob there. That's the EOP. It's right at the base of the skull when you have your head back a wee bit. The first time he went and spoke to the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he said to the right and 1 to 2 centimeters below the external occipital protuberance. And you saw that skull back there where they actually had a little circle below that level right there. Now remember back, Paul O'Connor had that diagram indicating a defect that was actually a little bit below the external occipital protuberance, and I'm going to show that again in a few minutes. The second time he came back before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, he sort of caved in saying, well, maybe it was near the cowlick, near the top of the head, 10 centimeters above the external occipital protuberance. That testimony is quite controversial. I think that Dr. Humes today would disavow any conclusions that the wound was that high, were he asked, and in fact he has, to the Journal of the American Medical Association. In any case, the Journal of the American Medical Association, they went and decided to toe the original line, and that was that it was to the right and just above the EOP. Now, I asked Dr. Boswell about this in my phone conversation. I won't play that part of it because there's only so much of this that I can, waste all our time playing, and it's not all that fascinating, but you can read what he says. Well, I tell you, what Jim and I agreed to in conference with the AMA people was that all the measurements and all the information in the autopsy report were the most valid, and that anything that might have been said subsequent to that had to be taken with a grain of salt. I think that some of that testimony that Jim Humes gave to the HSCA hearings, which were several years later and without any records and which were not very knowledgeable questionnaires, I think that some of that testimony might be suspect. So he's clearly telling me, Boswell's telling me, look, if Humes agreed that the wound was high, after being pressured by these guys, take it with a grain of salt. That testimony might be suspect. But Humes, I think, in a situation as a military pathologist, and that's why I think it is a bloody tragedy that Kennedy was not autopsied by civilians. Humes appears to have been willing to basically blow with the wind, and as a military man who acts under orders and who knows what a pariah he could easily have become, did he not do what was wanted and expected of him, seems to have been willing to go willy-nilly about these defects. Now, you recall the autopsy report that he signed saying that the defect was occipital and temporal and parietal. Dan Ratter asked him, and this is in the Journal of the American Medical Association, this exchange, it's published there, and where was the exit wound? Well, the exit wound was a large irregular wound to the front and side of the president's head. Now, Humes, I think, more than anyone else, and that's why I lay the blame to his feet, has been the one who's been willing to cave in. Now, the issue rested at that point until November 17, 1993, when before the Conyers Committee, Gerald Posner testified. And he said, I have interviewed the autopsy doctors. It is the work of the House Select Committee on Assassinations that had the 2 autopsy physicians change their mind about the wounds being low. Well, the 2 didn't. Humes may have, Boswell never did. Boswell was clearly wrong on that. That they had been mistaken about the placement of the wound here. low in the head, and that it is in fact correctly placed 4 inches higher, 10 centimeters higher at the top of the skull. I have spoken to them about this, and they have confirmed their change of testimony that they gave before the House Select Committee on Assassinations. I would be happy, Mr. Chairman, to ask Dr. Humes and Boswell if they would agree for their notes to be released to the National Archives. So now, we're totally confused. We don't know who to believe. Do we believe what they said? Boswell told me in this tape recording, Jim and I sat down a couple of years ago and agreed that the most valid statements are our original report because we labored long and hard over that. Would Humes and Boswell have said this to me, have given the testimony that the wound was low to the Journal of American Medical Association, and then told General Bosner something else? I don't think so. And so those of you who heard the tape recording, which I'm going to play again at the end of this, may not agree either. Well, puzzled by all this, I went and compiled the eyewitness testimonies, and I'm talking about the earliest eyewitness testimonies because, I mean, you can get the wounds all over the place if you see what people like Dr. Jenkins here from Parkland Hospital, Dr. Baxter here from Parkland Hospital, Dr. Perry, and others, even Peters, they were willing to basically all of a sudden start fudging their original views. But if you got their original sworn testimonies and contemporaneously written notes, and I compiled where they located the wound defect, and this is from Parkland Hospital. And you'll see that Giesecke said that the defect was rear and went from the front to the back of the skull, but the reason I put 2 asterisks after his name is that when he testified before the Warren Commission, he said it was on the left side of the skull. So he did make that mistake. Nevertheless, he's the only one out of 42 or 43 witnesses that got the side of the skull wrong. He said left rather than right. That ain't bad. You might think that people who were testifying many months later might make that error more frequently than 1 out of 42 or 43. So that ain't bad. So there were 41 out of 40, or 42 out of 43 were right about which side of the skull the defect was on. Kenneth Sawyer said that the defect went behind the ear, and in fact looked at the photographs, so the autopsy photographs, with me one day in San Francisco when he was there for the American College of Surgeons, and said, I think these photographs have been fudged here that show the back of the head intact because it was largely on the side of the head, but it did extend behind the ear. So that's what he said. And finally, Dr. Midget said also that it was right rear and right only on the right side. But you can see that every one of these people, and there are 21 listed here, I found a couple more as well go on, indicated the defect was in the right rear of the skull. But everyone argues, well, of course, that these people were busy trying to resuscitate the president, not closely examining the wounds. They weren't paying a lot of attention as to what the exact extent of the wound was, perhaps because he was lying back. It was a defect here more on the side, but it appeared more in the rear to them. Had they been in a position where they were more leisurely and not focused so much on resuscitating the president, they might very well have been more accurate in their interpretations. They only were off a couple of inches, you know. So now we go, and I decided I'd collect all the eyewitness testimonies of the Bethesda witnesses. And here are they. Same preponderance. 2 or 3 people describe a defect, right only or right anterior, but everyone says, with the exception of Captain Stover, who said it was the top of the skull, everyone said the defect was in the right rear of the skull. And we're talking about Francis O'Neill, an FBI agent. These guys are paid to make good observations and accurate observations. In a video program, he kept holding his hand over the right rear quadrant of his head, over and over and over again. And of course, you have the witnesses here, and this is from Robert Groden's book. Where are they putting their hand? Every one of them. There's Ken Salyer up on the top right corner. I spoke with him personally. I spoke personally with Paul Peters. He essentially pointed the same location to me. And look at all these people pointing the right rear quadrant of the head. There's Charles Crenshaw. I'll have a few choice comments about the American Medical Association with respect to him, an organization, by the way, that I'm a member of. Oh, here we go. I did not mean to exclude present company. Those of you may know this person who, as I understand it, is sitting in the audience, and let's include her comments as well. In any case, now, Marion Thomas Jenkins is an anesthesiologist and was on the faculty at Parkland Hospital, and he and Baxter have given incredibly inconsistent accounts of the wounds over the years, and he is held up as a model, and he is held up and essentially glorified in Posner's book, and also in the Journal of the American Medical Association, because he was willing to say 2 things. One, that Charles Crenshaw's depiction of the wounds of an exit defect in the rear of the skull and a defect in the rear of the skull and an entrance wound perhaps in the throat, that Crenshaw was basically full of it. Now, this is from Jenkins in Case Closed. The description of the cerebellum was my fault. Now, you recall the cerebellum is the part of the brain that is right back here at the base of the skull, right in here. So if you could see cerebellum on Jack Kennedy at the time after he was assassinated, that means that defect had to be very low in the back of the skull. The description of cerebellum was my fault. When I read my report over, I realized there could not be any cerebellum. The autopsy photo with the rear of the head intact and the protrusion of the parietal region is the way I remember it. I never did say occipital. Okay? Jenkins said identified cerebellum in a typed and signed note on the day of the assassinations, before the Warren Commission in 1964, in an interview with Andy Purdy before the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1977, and again finally in the AMA in a news magazine called the AMA News on 11/24/78. He had said cerebellum all the way along the line. For 15 years he had said cerebellum. And in fact, though I don't have a slide to show that, in his Warren Commission testimony he said occipital. So he said he never said occipital, and he did under oath to the Warren Commission, and that he realized early on that he was mistaken about cerebellum, and he continued to say cerebellum for 15 years. But this is the kind of person that the American Medical Association, or at least its journal editor, George Lundberg, and its writer, Dennis Brio, are willing to rely upon. And of course, author Gerald Posner doesn't even call into question or doesn't look up his previous sworn testimony. Now, the most important witness to these wounds at Parkland clearly was Kemp Clark. Kemp Clark was a professor of neurosurgery at the time and the head of the Department of Neurosurgery. If anyone knows what a neurosurgical wound is, it is a professor of neurosurgery, and he described the defect in the rear of the skull with cerebellum protruding and described it as occipital. So that was what he said originally to the Warren Commission, but he has been very silent about this ever since. No one can get an interview with him. Well, this fellow, David Narrow, a steel salesman from Tennessee, called him up on the phone and he spoke to him. And he went and visited him in Dallas and he spoke to him again. What he told Narrow was that, quote, Dr. Kemp Clark told me that on November 22nd he had observed a large hole in the back of the president's head and that the back of the head was blown out. When I asked if the wound was entry or exit point, Dr. Clark's response was, in my opinion, the wound was an exit wound. In 1994, someone who was in the best position to judge this wound because he pronounced him dead after examining the skull wound, Dr. Clark has been consistent over 31 years. He's continuing to say today what he said 31 years ago, that there was a defect in the rear of the skull. After this conversation, Narrow phoned Cyril Weck, told him what Clark had told Narrow. Weck suggested I call Clark again and asked him what type of brain tissue Clark observed in the ER at Parkland. I again reached Clark by phone, and he said the lower right occipital region of the head was blown out, and I saw cerebellum. Another witness, Ronald Jones, who was at Parkland, told the Warren Commission there was a large defect in the back side of the head, and there appeared to be an exit wound in the posterior portion of the skull. Fairly straightforward, okay? He told David Lifton, if you brought him in here today, based on what I saw, essentially, I'd say he was shot from the front. He told a student, Brad Parker, the same thing in 1992. If they brought him in today, I would, seeing what I saw, I would say that he was shot from the front. However, Gerald Posner, and it would be very interesting for me to see exactly what Jones told Posner, but Posner says, when I came in, I did not know there was a head wound. I just saw the neck and was not aware that there was a head wound for several minutes. Dr. Jones did not ever know there was a head wound for several minutes and then finally realized it was a large side wound. Did he ever say that? Never did, as far as I know, with blood and tissue that extended toward the rear from what you could tell of the mess that was there. Now, interestingly enough, if the defect in the skull was anterolateral, that would have been plainly visible to everybody that was resuscitating him. If the defect was in the rear and he's laying on his head, it might therefore not be so visible. So if there was an anterolateral defect, as the current view of Warren Commission apologists it's astounding that it was invisible. Now, in a recorded interview with Ron Jones, he said, yeah, I didn't think that there was any wound. I didn't appreciate any wound anyway in the right temporal area or the right side of the head, upper part of the head, over or in front of the ear or anything like that. I mean, this is his conversation, and he's speaking halting. These are taken directly from a recorded transcript. I suppose I wasn't supposed to admit that he recorded it, but hey, 31 years later. Okay, so here we have Gerald Posner again saying that he's interviewed the autopsy doctors and what they're saying. Posner said that he interviewed, now I asked him, I said, Posner said that he interviewed you and that you said you changed your mind and weren't agreeing with the autopsy. Well, that's not what he said at all, and I think that maybe at this point I will run this tape again for you, for people who did not hear it before. Where is it? I suppose there's a play on here someplace. Oh.
So Jim and I sat down a couple of years ago and agreed that the most valid statements are our original report, because we labored over that long and hard. You know, the autopsy went several hours. Right. We stayed there a long time and refreshed our notes and so forth, and then got together for 2 days later after that and wrote the report, and all the figures and data there is the most legitimate. And I would refer anybody back to that and swear by it.
Yeah, well, that's what most people say. That the more original the data, the more reliable it is.
We're now 30 years, you know. And,
But this author, Gerald Posner, said that he interviewed you and that you had changed your mind and that you weren't agreeing with that. You weren't agreeing with what the autopsy report said, and that he'd interviewed you in the last year. You know this guy Gerald Posner.
What did he say?
Gerald Posner, he's the author of that book, Case Closed.
I know him, yeah.
He said that he interviewed you and that you didn't agree with what you said in the Warren Commission report, that the wound was low in the back of the head, that you changed your mind and you placed the wound in the high in the back of the head.
No. That's first of all, I never talked to him.
Oh, you've never talked to him?
Jim talked to him.
Oh, okay.
I've read his book, and much of it I agree with, but there are a few things that are unquestionably wrong.
I see.
I haven't tried to correct it or anything, but...
Well, he doesn't say it, interestingly enough, he doesn't say it in his book, but somebody sent me a copy of his testimony before the Conyers Committee where he said that he'd spoken to both you and Jim, and that both you guys had changed your
that's
opinion.
not true, because I never talked to Posner.
Oh, okay. Well,
he called me, and I was out, and we never got back together. Jim, they did talk over...
In any case, I think it's real clear, and many of you heard this before, but I didn't want anyone to leave this conference not having heard Boswell tell me twice that he'd never spoken to Posner, because I think that this is an issue. I offered to make my evidence of his claim immediately available, challenged Posner to do so immediately, no delay, and he has not done so. I think that he is hoping that enough time will elapse that he will have spoken to Boswell in the interim, and I have reason to believe he has, and that he will try to confuse him as to the times when he spoke to him. I don't know how else to interpret it. I don't know that Boswell wasn't lying to me, but because he made so many other errors about Boswell's prior essentially caving in, that I have reason to suspect that that he's not accurate on this either. Now, and again, that's what he said, and we'll just go on here. It has to be recognized by everyone that this was not the kind of autopsy for which one would have expected by people chosen as the national representatives to do. I mean, it was a very inadequate autopsy. Dr. Wilbur opined that the deficiencies in the autopsy as published were so extensive as to preclude the effects of crisis, emotion, bewilderment, and confusion as explanations. And I think that there is probably some truth to that. My personal view is that they were under tremendous pressures to not do things such as dissect the tract in the neck and to come up with the correct conclusions. That I honestly believe that they were not acting as independent free agents as they very well should have been, or they would not have been criticized. And they weren't only criticized by Dr. Wilbur, they were also very strongly criticized by the forensics panel of the House Select Committee on Assassinations and other pathologists. Now, the interesting thing in terms of what we may now know about the medical evidence is also revealed in Boswell's conversation with me. And that is, Wallace Milam and I had had a number of conversations, and I remember one time on the car phone on the way home, which is normally the way I communicate with people, as those of you who have spoken with me know. I was talking to him about the fact that the autopsy report says 13-centimeter defect, and yet the face sheet prepared the very night of the autopsy, and therefore even closer to the autopsy than the autopsy report, which was prepared 2 days later, says 17 centimeters missing. And I thought to myself, I said to Wallace, gosh, do you think that maybe perhaps it was after the replacement of a fragment of bone in the back of his skull that the defect was then 13 centimeters? And we thought, well, who knows? It might be that way. We were in no position to judge. In any case, you can see that this came out, and unfortunately I don't have it beautifully queued up to play for you, but it is part of the recording in the transcript. On the face sheet, I asked him, on the face sheet you prepared, was the 17 centimeter meant to reflect the size of the wound before placing a fragment of bone that arrived late into the autopsy, into the occipital wound, and the 13 centimeters meant to reflect the size of the wound after the fragment was in place? Boswell answered, right. Was there one large defect in the head from fore to aft, or were there two? Just one defect. So what you see here, of course, is two defects. You see the defect of the bullet hole right here and the defect in the skull with intervening bone. What he is telling me, and I'm going to be going over this again, is that when the body arrived, this wasn't there. This is what the wound looked like after the bone was replaced. The diagram CE 388, which we just saw in color, showed the bone back in place. Right. Here it is, bone back in place, that the defect didn't look like that at all. Does the Rydberg diagram show the bone fragment back in place in the rear of the skull? And this is Boswell now. None of my words, him. Yeah, the wound of entrance was at the base of that defect, and the shelving on the inner surface of the bone was on half of the intact portion of the skull, and half on the fragment that we received from Dallas and replaced. So, in fact, what the skull may have looked like more in reality when they first examined it is more like this. I had a little artist kind of touch up the Rydberg diagram here to show you what it may well have looked like when they first examined the body. Here's a diagram of a skull taken from the side, external occipital protuberance here, showing perhaps what the defect would have looked like at the time. And of course, if you measure across from here to here, it is 17 centimeters, not 13 centimeters. And here is a diagram showing essentially the same thing for the back. Here is the defect as portrayed in Robert Groden's work, and I can't say he's too far off. And here we are back to Paul O'Connor's diagram. Well, I'll be damned. It's amazing how nicely this, fits with the words of Boswell, the autopsy face sheet prepared on the night of the diagram, and the eyewitness testimonies of everyone who saw a defect in the rear of the skull. Now, some information that some of you may be seeing today for the first time are diagrams prepared by people who were at Bethesda, who wrote diagrams depicting the wounds as they recall them for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. These diagrams were only released in the past 9 to 12 months or so. And you can see, I'm afraid I may not be able to read all the names up there. Maybe someone, I think, can anybody read that? Is that Kellerman? In any case, I think this is...
Kellerman's in the middle bottom.
Which one's this?
It's Kellerman in the middle.
No, Kellerman's middle bottom.
Oh, this is Kellerman here. Yeah, Kellerman here. Oh, no, this is O'Neill. This is O'Neill. There's an O'Neill. What's that?
Siebert is the next one over.
And then Siebert is this one.
Yeah.
Okay, so you got O'Neill, right rear quadrant of the head. Now, these are people who are looking at an autopsy being done by someone else. They're under no duress. They're there for hours, just watching them examine the wounds. And you know they spent an enormous amount of time on the skull wound. And you can see here's Robinson, the guy who prepared the skull for burial. The defect that was present, according to the guy who prepared the head for burial, after they put out all together, the only part that was missing was a defect in the rear of the skull. They didn't write the side, he didn't write the front, he didn't write the left, right square. Now, maybe he's off a little bit. Maybe there's a little bit more to the right than the left. I'm willing to grant him that. Here is Kellerman is this one right here. He got the wrong side of the head, but he shows a defect in the rear anyhow. That's the body from behind with the back wound here and a defect here. Okay, and here we have, this is Lipsy's as I recall, and this is the only one that shows the defect largely on the right side, but again, right rear. And so on we go. Now, questions now have come up about the possible tampering of x-rays and photographs, which I'd like to touch upon that, and I'll conclude. The x-rays and photographs, and you'll find this in Harold Weisberg's book, Post-Mortem, this document, which Humes, Boswell, and Stringer and Ebersol signed. The x-rays and photographs described and listed above include all the x-rays and photographs taken by us during the autopsy, and we have no reason to believe that any other photographs or x-rays were made during the autopsy. Now, their signatures appear at the bottom of this document, and this is an inventory of photographs and x-rays that they have just finished looking at. But the interesting thing about this is that I am overwhelmingly convinced they didn't prepare this document. And in fact, in a document which I did not bring and don't have a slide of, Fink, whose name does not appear at the bottom of this, who saw this same inventory a few days later, wrote in a memo that this inventory of photographs was prepared by the Justice Department. And this document appeared in the last several months from a good fellow from the U.S. Department of Justice, Carl Belcher. On the afternoon of November 10th, I took the original and one copy of the document entitled Report of Inspection by Naval Medical Staff on November 1 at the National Archives to the Naval Medical Center, where it was read and signed by Captain Hughes, Boswell, Eversole, and Stringer. Certain corrections were made. This document, as Dr. Fink had said, had been prepared by the Justice Department. It was carried over by Belcher and signed by these people. So they didn't volunteer that this x-ray and photographic inventory was complete. Someone else put that in there, as you might very well have expected it would have been done, you know, in the bureaucratic tradition to try to close this case. They had to try to insist that this photographic inventory was complete. However, every one of those people had disputed the photographic inventory that they had. Before the House Select Committee on Assassinations, Andy Purdy asked Fink, we have a black and white blow-up of that same spot. This is the back of the head showing in fact it's not F8, but it's the back of the head showing the scalp intact. That you previously mentioned that your attempt was here to photograph the crater, I think was the word that you used. Oh no, it was F8. He says, yes, in the bone, but not in the scalp, because to determine the direction of the projectile, the bone is a very good source of information, so I emphasize the photographs of the crater taken from inside the skull. What you are showing me is soft tissue wound in the scalp. And what he was showing him was this. Soft tissue wound in the scalp doesn't show any kind of a cratering, and it was not the photograph that he recalled having taken, because he testified that he has said that he took a photograph of the occipital wound, internal and external aspects, to prove the beveling and so to prove the direction of the bullet. That photograph, I've seen the originals, does not exist in the inventory. And he was insistent about this. Stringer said he remembered having taken at least 2 exposures to the body cavity. Hume specifically recalled photographs were taken of the president's chest. These photographs do not exist. Boswell said they thought they photographed the exposed thoracic cavity and lung, but doesn't remember ever seeing those photographs. He told me he remembered that they took photographs of the interior chest, and that they never saw those photographs. Robert Carnine recalls them putting the probe in and taking pictures, and the body was on its side. Who knows whether they were taking photographs of the interior of the chest, but if the body was on its side with a probe in the body, they would probably be wanting to photograph where that probe was intending the interior of the chest. I'm sure that that was a photograph of the interior of the chest that all these other people recalled. And Floyd Reeve, finally, to finish the loop here, also said that he thought he took about 6 pictures. I think it was 3 film packs of internal portions of the body. So now you have the interesting situation. And Stringer said it was his recollection that, now this is the guy that is the autopsy photographer, that it was his recollection that all the photographs he had taken were not present in 1966 when he first saw the photographs. He noted that the receipt said that he had some of the film holders had no film in one side of the cassettes. He said the receipt said that this happened in 2 or 3 of the film holders where one side only was allegedly loaded. He said he could understand if the film holders were reported to have been poorly exposed or defective film, but he could not believe, and can any photographer believe who uses a view camera? You know whether there's film or not in a view camera. Could not believe that there were any sides on the film holders which were not loaded with film. So we have both autopsy photographers, Stringer and Reeve, all of JFK's pathologists, including and Dr. Robert Carnine, who was also a pathologist who happened to be an observer, recalling the taking of photographs that do not now exist. I think that there's good reason to suspect that this photographic inventory is incomplete. What should we trust, the photographs we have, or the Justice Department's stating that the photographic inventory is complete, and these guys, being good military people under orders, what do you think they're going to sign? They're going to dispute inventory? They have continued, ever since signing that document, they have continued to insist that the photographs that they took, that there are some photographs they took that don't exist. Now, just to get into the X-ray evidence briefly, and we'll conclude, and we see this photograph. This is a copy of the X-ray that they looked at on the night of the assassination, and I think that anyone who looks at this photograph and doesn't realize that there is a large fragment here. This is the largest fragment in the body, the largest bullet fragment that is in the body. Now, that is the fragment. I've seen the originals. The originals are obviously clearer than this, but nonetheless, that stands out at you like a sore thumb in the originals as it does in this copy of the original. This is not the enhanced version, incidentally, that you're liable to pick up in most of the books, you know, High Treason and High Treason 2 and so on and so forth. This is an unenhanced X-ray. Now, in the enhanced X-rays, you can lose this little fragment because everything else is enhanced so much that you hardly notice it. But in the originals, that little fragment stands out much more prominently, and it is that fragment they're supposed to have missed. Now, this is an image done from David Mantik's work. That fragment is in this little arrow right here, and you can see it's almost invisible on the lateral film, and it is hard to see it even on the original. You can see it much more clearly than you can on these reproductions. Oops, went too far. But you can see this little fragment right here very plainly, and so it is like a sliver of bullet. Or just a shaving. Interestingly enough, it just happened to be a cross-section of the bullet, 6.5 millimeters in diameter, and people have argued that this 6.5 millimeter obviously came from the Carcano because it was 6.5 millimeters in size. The oddity here, and there are several of them, is number one, that the nose of the bullet was found in the front seat, the tail of the bullet was found in the front seat, and so somehow you have a cross-section of the bullet being deposited on the outside of the skull, while the nose and the tail of the bullet make it to the front seat of the skull. Not very likely. Howard Donahue has observed in his book by Menninger that if this had been shaved off, which has been the argument that a fragment of the bullet, of a full metal jacketed bullet was shaved off in this way, it would have tended to deposit it near the top of the entrance wound rather than below because it was coming from above down, and as we've seen here, it is actually deposited below the skull wound rather than above. It also is the most prominent fragment in the skull, and they were charged by Berkeley to go in and find the fragments of the skull, and yet they omitted finding this one, and this was the easiest one to find. It was right there under the scalp, laying on the skull. So David Mantik has done some work with densitometry, and the work that David Mantik, who was a professor of physics before he went to medical school and is now a radiation oncologist with a lot of experience in radiology, he has done some X-ray, some measurements on the X-rays, measuring the density of, or the opacification, level of opacification of the X-rays. And he has compared these X-rays with other X-rays to find some very astonishing and unusual things. First of all, on that fragment back there, the densitometry measurements on the lateral film of that fragment are in stark contrast to what you see on the anterior-posterior. They're inconsistent. So perhaps that anterior-posterior X-ray was tampered with in a way to make that fragment back there seem larger, because the two FBI agents who were there, Siebert and O'Neill, said in their report that the largest fragment was behind the eye and the second largest fragment was in the rear of the skull. But in the X-rays that we now have, it's exactly the opposite. The largest fragment is the rear of the skull, and this one's up in front. If they wanted to tamper, that might have been something they would have chosen to do. But David Mantik's work has shown that if you compare, and you can do this by measuring the amount of light that transmits through these X-rays, the darker the amount of light, the darker the portion, the less bone was there. So you can come up with a ratio between the amount of light that gets through here and the amount of light that gets through there. A lot of light gets through here, and very little gets through here because it's so dark. When you compare this, normally in an X-ray and a lateral film, you will have about 2 or 3 times as much light coming through an X-ray in the posterior aspect of the skull, of a skull X-ray, as you do in the front. When you have some bony defects in the front, you know, from gunshot wounds, the ratio may go up as high as 5, perhaps even as high as 10 to 1, as much light coming through the X-ray in the back as here. In Jack Kennedy's, there is very close to 1,000 times as much light coming through the X-ray in the lateral film on densitometry measurements as comes through the X-ray in the front of the skull. This is so far from what we would have expected to be normal that it has persuaded David Mantik that there's been some tampering in this X-rays. Moreover, if you measure the amount of the density of the bone around what we call the petrous bone, and this is an enhanced X-ray, and so it tends to underemphasize how dense this bone is around the petrous bone, which is right down in here. And on the original X-rays, you can measure it much more easily. You find that the petrous bone is the hardest bone in the body, and it's your ear bone. And it runs from one side of the skull through the middle of the skull, and you have another ear bone on the other side. So it basically is bone from one side of the skull to the other side of the skull.
and the densitometry measurements of the petrous bone on the lateral film are virtually as high as the bone in the back of the skull, indicating that if these measurements are accurate, it means the back of his head was filled with bone, not brain, something which people who have heard him speak argue probably isn't true. In any case, I wanted to make a brief comment about, and I probably should have included this with my tape recording, but I didn't. Two people on CompuServe bulletin board, Gerald McNally and Robert Artwell, have come forward to say that Gerald Posner has irrefutable proof of his interviews with them and what they've said. And that was August 10th. That's 3 months ago that I heard from them. No one's seen this proof yet. There's Robert Artwell. Now, this is a funny thing. It's odd to me in the extreme. Were Artwell to say that he conducted an interview with someone, he's a physician, were he to say that he conducted an interview with someone and so-and-so said someone, thus and such, I would never say that wasn't true. I would say, well, let's see what the evidence is. But he immediately gets a phone call from Gerald Posner, and he must know about the myriad factual errors in Posner's book. And he immediately sallies forth in Posner's defense because Posner doesn't have the unmitigated testicular tissue to sally forth in his own. Presumably, here he is basically covering for Posner. What's going on? Very odd. Now, to finish up, I want to end up on something which some of you may know. Many of you may have this book or have read this book or are familiar with the fact that Charles Crenshaw wrote a book basically calling into question the single bullet theory and the description of the skull wounds that make it consistent with a shot from above and behind. He was slammed in the Journal of the American Medical Association. He was slammed by Gerald Posner. The Journal of the American Medical Association didn't have the decency, which is a common and expected and respectable courtesy of any kind of journalism, to ask him for a comment before they put a nasty comment in there. They put in the comments of Baxter principally, as well as the assent of Dr. Perry, Baxter, and Jenkins, that he probably wasn't even there. They didn't think he was there, and left that in there. If they bothered to look at the Warren Commission volumes, they'd have found that Baxter was asked who was in the trauma room with him, and he named 6 people. The first person he named under oath to the Warren Commission was Charles Crenshaw. And Crenshaw, in fact, is mentioned in Volume 2 of the Warren Commission on page, Volume 6, page 28, 32, 40, 60, 80, and 131. There are 5 witnesses to his presence there, and he's also mentioned in news accounts that are contemporaneously written. He wrote to them a long letter of response to the Journal of the American Medical Association and also to the Dallas Morning News because they had picked up the story and basically tried to slam him, saying he didn't know what he was talking about, he wasn't even there. He wrote a long letter of response proving that he was there. The Journal of the American Medical Association wouldn't publish it, suggested he write a 500-word letter, which he did. They wouldn't publish that. And they have refused to correct the factual error they made about his presence there. In any case, here's what JAMA said, okay? Here we go. Since it is hard to prove a negative, no one can say with certainty what some suspect that Crenshaw was not even in the trauma room. None of the 4, Baxter, Perry, Carrico, and Jenkins, recalls ever seeing him at the scene. Before Spector, Baxter says, can you identify the doctors who were there at the time? Oh, let's see. There was Crenshaw, Peters, Clark, yada, yada, yada. He's also mentioned in these other people. Dr. McClellan. 2 of the doctors who were there, who were interviewed by JAMA, identified him under oath. I can report to you now that the Journal of the American Medical Association was sued by Crenshaw for this defamation, and I think justly so. If the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I'm a member of the American Medical Association, and I'm active politically, I'm on the board of trustees of the San Francisco Medical Society. When I had a little more time, I was a delegate to the California Medical Association. And if they have no respect for the truth, at least one would have hoped that they would have corrected an error when they found it, particularly a slanderous error like this. Charles Crenshaw had to sue them, and they have finally agreed to an out-of-court settlement for a huge sum of money, and it has been estimated by the people who are in the know that the American Medical Association itself, in its own defense, in attorney's fees, not even considering what they had to pay Crenshaw and Gary Shaw for the slanders in this suit, are probably out of pocket $1 million. You can turn the lights up if you like. Just go turn the lights up. They're probably out of pocket $1 million. But the more fascinating thing is that, of course, George Lundberg is a personal friend. He's a former military pathologist himself and a personal friend of the autopsy pathologists. And so here's a guy who clearly knows what he wants the truth to appear to be and is unwilling to stand by the truth, and he does it in the name of science and of truth. And I think that that's the biggest tragedy of all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gary Aguilar. Very good presentation. Thank you, sir. It's quite a bit of information. Next up, Joseph Riley, Neurosciences. In his presentation, he has a lot of things to show to you and a lot of information to give to you. Yes, sir. Go ahead. You're fine.
This afternoon, we're going to talk about John Kennedy's body as though it were simply a piece of evidence, and we will not be dealing with any of the arguments and issues that have been brought forward by different testimony. What we're going to be doing is taking a strict, hard-nosed, tough look at science about the medical evidence. What I want to make very clear is I'm going to make some very strong assertions, and it will be up to you to evaluate the accuracy and the usefulness of those assertions. Number one, we know beyond doubt, based on its own evidence, that the official story is wrong, that there are inherent contradictions in the medical evidence that until now have not been pointed out. What you will see is that the description by the House Select Committee on Assassinations is a scientific travesty. It directly contradicts its own information, and the conclusion is inescapable that it cannot be correct. Okay. That's all right. The second part of this presentation will be that most of the confusion and most of the controversy over the medical evidence has a simple explanation, and that is a misinterpretation of the geometric relationship between the lateral X-ray and the frontal X-ray. And I'm sure that's perfectly clear to everybody what that means. We will come to exactly what that means, but until now, the frontal X-ray and lateral X-ray have been thought to be in a specific alignment, and people have tried to put together a picture from that alignment. Not very successfully. As you can tell by now, there's very little anyone agrees to in describing the medical information. All right, what we're going to see is that that alignment is demonstrably wrong. That this will be, I will not be giving, these will not be debatable issues, they will be resolvable issues. That is, we will deal only with empirical measurements. You make the measurements, you judge the logic, but we will not be getting into somebody testified thus and such. All right, we will be accepting the medical evidence as legitimate, unaltered, perhaps incomplete, but nevertheless we will accept the ground rules that everything before us is legitimate, and we will have to deal with it accordingly. The third assertion is that after you make the correction about the angles in which the X-rays are related, that a new, coherent, clear, systematic, it all fits together picture emerges of what happened to John Kennedy, the head wounds of John Kennedy. 2 bullets. What we've always known, one from the right front, the first bullet. The second bullet from the rear. What we will see is, in fact, Dr. Humes and Boswell and Fink got part of the answer. They didn't get the whole story. This is going to be a tough go for a lot of people. And once again, if you didn't get a handout, I would recommend you do. I want to emphasize we're dealing solely with the head wounds. I think that you probably will get no insight from me on the single bullet theory. That's been covered pretty extensively. We're dealing solely with the head wounds, and this is all science, folks. I mean, this is not about testimony of people. We're taking the medical evidence record as being legitimate, and we're going to see if what we've been told is correct. Okay, fortunately, Gary's covered some of this material, so we have essentially our first clue that something might be wrong is the Warren Commission, as Gary showed, okay, had this description of the wound, and then all subsequent government panels came along and said, no, the entrance wound was not here, it was high up, okay? See it up here. That should be our first clue because the government's position is catch-22. The Warren Commission says the autopsy evidence supports the conclusion of a lone assassin shooting from the 6th floor window of a school book depository. Period. It's consistent. Along comes the government report, the Clark panel, then later the House Select Committee on Assassination saying, no, the wound's not there, it's 4 inches off of that, and now the results support the conclusion of a lone assassin. You can't have it both ways. That doesn't disprove the lone assassin theory, but it is certainly a reason to be skeptical about the conclusions that have been drawn from the medical evidence. All right. Just by very quick review, okay, just so we don't lose anybody, I just want to point out that we will be dealing largely with the House Select Committee interpretation as quote-unquote the official story. A few anatomical landmarks to be aware of. This is the occipital suture. All right. This is occipital bone. This is parietal. This is frontal bone, and this line here is called the coronal suture. According to the description by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the entrance wound was roughly here, the exit wound was here. Note that the exit wound is considered to be on the coronal suture. Now I would like to point out one thing. I think that there are certainly a number of things yet to be resolved about the medical evidence. But the dispute over the rear head wound, the description in Parkland versus Bethesda, be aware that what the x-rays show, this will mark out, how much skull is missing. Okay? So that in the x-rays, in the evidence that we have, it shows that everything in front of here is gone, one way or the other. It's been blown off or it's detached. So when someone says there's a wound here, that is not inconsistent with the medical evidence. I just want to point that out. Okay. This perhaps will give you some idea. This is a little bit clearer. What we have is the in-shoot, the out-shoot. What we remember that the original description, the in-shoot was here, and then just sort of this amorphous shot out. So, one more time, taking a look at that. And here's where it becomes, if it weren't so damn tragic, it would be funny. The House Select Committee, there is no way to begin to tell you as a scientist how appalling that report is. For example, you're told about Sherrington's experiments about cerebral rigidity as possibly an explanation for John Kennedy's movement, a neuromuscular reaction. Okay? As absurd as that seems, it's far worse than that, because Sherrington worked in a reflex arc having to do with cats. There is no such reflex in primates. All right? So they've not only invoked a speculation, but a speculation of the wrong species. And that is about the quality that goes throughout that document. And this is the first giveaway. Okay? It is something that in retrospect is so obvious, and yet until now, people have not noticed it. These represent bone fragments that were recovered. This is the House Select Committee's description of the wound that was created. The bone fragments here are in scale to each other, but in a different scale to the skull. All right, so that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is this fragment. This fragment is triangular. It was described by Dr. Angel convincingly, and a lot of this I would be glad, like after the lecture, to go into the details of some of the things that may not seem so clear. There's no question that's frontal bone. All right. It was also accepted by the House Select Committee on Assassination that this represented the coronal suture. It was fractured along the suture line. And metallic fragments are seen here. All right. So, the House Select Committee then says that this fits into the exit wound located here. Except there's a real problem in their description. Notice what is here. What the House Select Committee doesn't ever mention in the report is that now they have changed the total description, first of the head wounds. All right, there's no question that there is damage to the frontal bone itself. At the Dr. Angel, who did the best analysis for them, showing right here, you can see, and it's clear on the x-rays, and nobody's going to argue. You can argue about how far forward the damage is, but there's no question that there's damage at the coronal suture. All right? And in Dr. Angel's analysis, it made perfect sense. He has a piece of frontal bone, coronal suture, metal, fits into their conception of an exit wound at this point. But notice what happened here. The House Select Committee, without saying a word about it, now says, well, this fits in parietal. It's no longer frontal bone. It cannot be the way they describe it. That is frontal bone. They accepted it as frontal bone. But there is no coronal suture for it to fit against. But they're trying to preserve it. They have a direct, inexplicable contradiction in their own description of the exit wound. You cannot fit that triangular piece into any kind of exit wound because you're saying it's frontal bone and coronal suture is there, except, well, we have some frontal bone there and we also have coronal suture. It doesn't work. So we know that the exit wound is not as described by the House Select Committee on Assassination. But they are masters at selective use of information. God knows we don't want to try to correlate things or make things consistent. So if they got the exit wound wrong, is it possible they got the entrance wound wrong? As Gary showed, there's a lot of ambiguity about the lateral x-ray, and it takes some imagination to try to see an entrance wound where the House Select Committee says there is an entrance wound. We can argue radiology all we want, but I want to point something else out to you. Dr. David Mandick and Dr. Robert Artwell, who are not exactly on agreement on many things, both agree. I asked them about their observations, and I do warn you, some of these pictures are gruesome. We will use, but most of you are familiar with this. This looks like a mess. real big miss, unless you're an anatomist. If you're an anatomist or a neuroanatomist, you see these things in here? No problem. Intact cerebral cortex. Surface of the cerebral cortex, pardon the description, but it looks like small sausages packed together. You have bumps and grooves, all right, and long lines, sausage-like. We'll not worry about the fancy names for them, except that the brain is, those bumps and grooves are organized in a pattern, all right, and it's not random. So different parts of the brain look different. And so you can see, you're going to have to take my word for this right now, and I can go through the detail, but also people who have no agreement about the conclusions that we're talking about agree that this is intact cerebral cortex. There's just no question. And you can do high-resolution scans, and it gets even more complicated. All right, so what does that mean? Can we make anything of that? Well, yes, you can. If you're an anatomist, you say, well, you look at the head here, and you look at the conformation, and then you know something about the normal structure of the brain. This is simply taken out of an atlas, all right? And you can look at the relative location, and yeah, by God, that is the quote-unquote superior parietal lobule, which is a real fancy name. What it means is it's the part of cortex that's right there, which is exactly what you see in the photograph. Okay, why is that important? Remember where the entrance wound was, according to the House Select Committee on Assassination? Right here. So what does that mean? That means that the skull that the hole is in, supposedly, is immediately over the superior parietal lobule. So you have a description now of an entrance wound of a bullet that supposedly does massive brain damage, except the cortex that gets hit first is intact. Okay? So we know they've blown the exit wound. We don't know where the exit wound is yet, but we know they've blown that. We have the government saying, well, the autopsy preceptors, they goofed. They made a mistake in the localization. It's up high. Okay? Except when you look up high, that's exactly where the bullet should have done damage. You have a picture of that cortex. No doubt about it. You haven't got an entrance wound and you haven't got an exit wound. What you have is a pitiful, pitiful document that pretends to be science. So, the title was Medical Contradictions, and believe me, there are many, many more. But what we can conclude is we know the official story is wrong. All right, so the question is, can we make some sense out of all this stuff? No doubt we've all heard the endless complexities of trying to figure this stuff out. What I want to suggest to you is that it in fact does make sense, but it takes a while to get there. Maybe this is going to, if you can get this, if I can explain this well enough for you to understand what I'm talking about, then I think you'll be on solid ground. Don't worry about names of particular structures. That's not important. What we're going to be seeing is like a logic puzzle. Okay. We have a lateral X-ray. Yeah, it's easier to do it here, isn't it? Okay, we have a lateral X-ray, which is representing, it's just a side, taking a picture of the side of the head. Then we have a picture taken from the front. All right. The the description, or until now, has always been that the frontal X-ray was taken at an angle relative to the face. In other words, the lateral, we're taking the picture just like this. straight onto the side of the head. Everybody has interpreted the frontal X-ray as being taken, instead of front on, at an angle. Okay? That angle being, you can calculate 23.6 degrees, all right, relative to the external facial axis. That has been the way it has always been thought of. And there's some good reasons for that. You get a relatively good correlation in some of the things Gary went through. He talked about some of the fragments back here, and then you get correspondence in fragments here with this fragment and that sort of thing. You get a relatively good correspondence if that's all you look at. If you only look at what corresponds, sure, you can find some points that match, and they match in some very important places. But if you look at the whole story, you find some very important contradictions to that description. Let me tell you, as an anatomist, it was quite clear, and I can't ask you to believe me, take my word for it. We'll go through some of the arguments. I'm simply saying that as an anatomist, looking at the first picture, there was no doubt. That frontal X-ray was taken straight on to the face. No doubt about it. Now I'll try to show you some of the reasons why I think that. What we can do, let's ignore the bottom half. Okay, we're dealing with the top half. Essentially what we can do is align the two interpretations, all right, against, this is the frontal X-ray, this is the official story, the standard interpretation of the angle of the X-ray, and you can see that there are corresponding points. Okay. What I'm going to argue is that the accurate relationship between these two X-rays is better represented by this relationship. Okay. The frontal X-ray was taken almost straight on. I will be delighted to go into extreme esoteric detail with anyone who wants to, but I will not take up your time with it in terms of matching particular fragments, particular details. All right, we can spend a lot of time doing that, but what we need to know is which one's correct. Okay, can we make a test between these two alternative views? Can we say, all right, if this one is correct, thus and such must happen, and if it doesn't happen, it's wrong. Okay? It's that simple. In the interpretation that I give, I will say this. Show me a contradiction, I will throw it out. That's the way science is. There is objective truth. So, let's do a test. We've got the frontal X-ray, we've got the lateral X-ray. Okay? And we've superimposed. These have been adjusted so that they are on the same scale. And we've put just a head, and we fitted this in. So we have two different interpretations. The standard interpretation is the beam is coming from below and capturing this image, okay, between these parallel lines. The position that I'm arguing is that no, this is the way the picture is being taken. And you take the picture this way, and you're capturing between these two lines. Okay? Now, if this were a class of students, I'd be asking questions now about what do you see as being a problem with the various interpretations. But this isn't a classroom, so I'll get on with it. What you have here is this beam, everything between these two lines must show up on the X-ray. Must show up on the X-ray. Okay? Do we see it? What doesn't show up? What doesn't show up are the teeth. Clearly. In fact, let's make it a little bit more explicit. Here, same sort of thing. Here we've just taken a normal lateral x-ray, put it on to a head to show you. This is what must occur. Everything above this line must show on this image. That means both sets of teeth. It doesn't. Okay? In this image, you predict palate. Hard palate, but not getting down into the teeth. That's exactly what you see. And anyone who would like, there are at least 6 or 7 other ways to show the same thing. All right, different tests that can be constructed. I can only tell you that I have tried to construct every test that I could think of, and it all comes out the same way. There is no way. What you have is a straight-out contradiction in an angled interpretation. It can't be. Now, one of the consequences of that, I'm going to skip over this by and large because we're getting, but I just want to mention that some of the stuff that was talked about in terms of quote-unquote contradictions having to do with fragments. One of the consequences is that the fragments reverse in interpretation. But this circular fragment, let me get back to a picture that'll help make more sense of it. Yeah, this will possibly work. You have a fragment here and a fragment here. Okay, and you have the round fragment, and my eyes are going, okay, which supposedly corresponds to this back. Now that's a standard interpretation till now. And so Dr. Humes was accused of not seeing this round fragment on the back of the skull. But in the interview with the House Select Committee on Assassination, he identified the round fragment as being in the right supraorbital ridge. If you have the handout, there is a reasonably good comparison of the 3 views, and what you'll see is that the round fragment that is so prominent on the frontal x-ray corresponds exactly to a fragment embedded in the supraorbital ridge on the lateral x-ray, okay, and that this thing in the back, okay, corresponds exactly to a fragment that you see up here on the x-ray. So, no, they didn't miss something on the back of the head. What was on the back of the head was a sliver of metal, okay. I would point out, I have a great deal of respect for David Mandick's application of a new method to study the x-rays, but note that the argument that the inconsistency between his measurements on the metal fragments disappears if you reverse the correspondence. In other words, one of David's arguments is that, remember, this shows greater density at the bottom. Well, that's exactly what you see. I think I'm probably getting too far afield. We'll skip fragments. Okay, it's a bit. I'll show you now. So what we have is 1, an official story that doesn't work. 2, maybe a different point of view on the medical evidence. We know that the way the x-rays have been looked at doesn't work. It leads to contradictions that are inescapable. We have another way of looking at the relationship, so we can try and see what sort of picture comes out of that interpretation. Does it start to make any sense, or at least more sense than it's made until now. Okay. One diagram that I do not know what happened to, so I would just call your attention to it. It's in the handout. Simply to point out something that if you're serious about this stuff, you stick with empirical measurements, not impressions. All right? People talk about a wound in the cowlick area, and it's on this page. You can see, and Gary showed the picture. Well, all well and good to think that it's a cowlick, okay? But you've given one empirical measurement that it is 13 centimeters, basic scientists say centimeters, not centimeters, okay, from the neck fold, okay? That's the one empirical measurement you have. You measure up from the base of the neck, 13 centimeters, where does it put you? Right where Humes and Boswell originally described an entrance wound. I would point out, in fairness to Dr. Humes, and Gary pointed out that it was a controversial interpretation about Humes' retraction. Another interpretation of Humes' statement is he is retracting his characterization of a piece of tissue that is on the base of the skull as being the entrance site. He does not retract the positioning of the entrance wound at being near the external occipital protuberance. I mean, that, and Gary pointed out, it was controversial interpretation. All right. So, what happens now? Well, first, let's talk about Dr. Humes and their description. We shift the x-rays around and we look at right around where they described an entrance wound. Do we see any correlations? Damn right we do. Right here and right here, a hole. Okay? You won't see them match in the other orientation because they're skewed. Does it? And we said that we have this fragment in the right supraorbital ridge, which is what Dr. Humes said in his interview with the House Select Committee on Assassination. Now, if we read the autopsy description of the subcortical brain damage, that is, cortex means bark, the outer surface. Okay, subcortical is the inside of the brain. Okay, if you read the description of all the damage done subcortically, what you get is a line of structures that are damaged. And the pathway that you can follow from the description is roughly like this, and if you were to take it right at the midline of the brain, it's not exactly at the midline of the brain, it's about an inch over. It lines up just like that. All the structures subcortically that are damaged are totally fall along that pathway. That pathway corresponds anatomically exactly to that pathway. Now we have something weird happening with the brain, besides it disappearing. The House Select Committee, everyone has characterized it as massive brain damage, except the weight, the brain weight, was around 1,500 grams, which is at the upper limit of a normal brain. So we see massive brain damage, but what's going on? Keeping in mind, if this is the trajectory of the rear bullet, coming from behind, going to the right supraorbital ridge, these are the structures that are torn up. So that's going to correspond. This is now we're taking a cut through the brain like this and looking at what would happen if you drilled a hole through that part of the brain. And what would happen is the brain, as you would fix it, put it in fixative, is this would fold out, okay? Which is exactly what's going on here. This is the drawing of John Kennedy's brain, okay, from the supplemental, or from the House Select Committee. And what you see is this extends beyond the normal limits of the brain. Well, you don't create brain by damaging it, all right? You have to explain why the brain on this side appears larger in surface area than on the other side. Well, that's very simple. This part has detached and folded over. Consistent with that, and I'll be glad to argue the esoterica with anybody after the lecture, is you can actually identify anatomical structures along here. The cerebral cortex bends in right along the midline, okay, and the cortex along there is called cingulate cortex. And those bumps and grooves have a particular pattern, and what you can see in there is cingulate gyrus. Okay. So now you have a reasonable explanation of the subcortical damage, where it came from. What you don't have is an explanation for the cortical damage. Now let me explain what I mean by that. And you probably see this better. Once again, we're missing some pictures, but they are in the handout. Okay, we'll see if these come through. These are from the National Archives. If you'll notice now, we had the damage going in a line like this through the center of the brain. Well, remember back we said that the government changed the description of the original entrance wound to way up. Very few people have asked, well, why? I mean, was it really because there was a hole there, or is there a necessity for it? And there is a necessity for it, or the whole game falls apart. Because what you see are trails of metal fragments in the outer surface of the brain. The outer surface of the brain, like here. Okay? So now you've got a problem. You've got subcortical brain damage. How absurd does this get? But these people do not put these things together. You've got a hole drilled through the center of the brain. Nothing in between except, wham, a bunch of metal scattered out in a sheet. Does it take a genius to figure out that one bullet didn't do that? Okay. So you've got to account for this. And then from over here you see it distributed like that. And in fact, can we do that? If once we've made the reinterpretation of the angles of the relationship, you do in fact, it becomes very clear. And I would hope, if nothing else, I do not know what has happened to some of the transparencies, but on this sheet, what you will see is the evidence, what we've always known for the right front shot. 313.
What image are you referring to? What page is it on?
Okay, that's going to be 15. You'll see the blow up. This right here. Okay? That's disrupted skull. Remember that now we're taking a picture through skull that is both normal and abnormal. That is, if we have a hole here, but we're taking it through, we're going to see both intact skull and damaged skull. So what we're looking for is some sort of disruption to see if there's anything going on there. And if we look at the frontal, at exactly the corresponding point. And I think this is probably going to be easier for you to see on that. Right here. I've just put these together
the diagram will show them arranged at the correct heights relative to each other. You see a semilunar defect. That's exactly the defect Dr. Angel described in the front. He described maybe this is the exit wound because you sure got that hold, because notice something else. See, I kind of cheated. The reason I found those spots, you just follow the metal. Just follow the metal. The metal trail leads right to that point. So, if is it possible that that is the frontal entrance wound? Okay, if that's the frontal entrance wound, which is anatomically right there, does that really surprise anybody here? That's what the anatomy says. That's what the photographs say. That's what the x-rays say, despite what we were told. If that's true, though, we've got to account for the exit wound. So, be consistent. We follow the metal trail back. Now, would anyone like to debate the anatomy of F8? Location of the exit defect. If you've had much experience with arguing about the medical evidence, F8, this thing becomes a nightmare, and even trying to find a common vocabulary to talk to each other. What I would like to point out is it really is pretty simple for an anatomist. I won't go through all the stuff, but it's really, you have certain structures that only occur in a certain way. And in fact, I would point out that Paul O'Connor described what F8 represented fairly accurately. But I guess Gary's going, would point out that Paul O'Connor's drawing is of F8, not of the intact head, all right, after the brain has been removed. The middle picture shows you roughly what it represents. Okay, this, looking down at the top, this is the exit wound. Okay, corresponding here. I will be glad to go through the esoterica of interpreting this thing. There's no problem. Right? It can only be a certain way. So let's be consistent. Let's check things against the other. Everything has got to fit. There's no getting around it. All right? We will have no pity. Everything has to fit together. If this interpretation is correct, what do we see there on the lateral x-ray? See, we're saying that the exit wound it has a name. A cortical landmark, a skull landmark. Where the coronal suture meets the sagittal suture is called bregma. Okay? And what we're saying is that the exit wound there is just posterior to bregma. All right? Which, if we look on the lateral x-ray, is this region, and you will see the curved defect. So, what do we have? We have two wounds, and end of the official story. We take their evidence, we take all of it, we test all of it, and it is inescapable that the official story is wrong. It is provably wrong. It's a matter, take these diagrams, measure for yourself. Try to figure out ways to test, because the official story won't work. We have another interpretation, which is very straightforward, and when we make the change, just make that one switch in interpretation of the x-rays, something really strange happens. It all makes sense. Now, I'm not saying every little question is resolved, but in terms of describing the head wounds, everything is consistent. Two shots. and one of them from the right front. I can only leave you with an aphorism from Zen that I put at the beginning of the article, that the great tragedy here is from the beginning, everything is clear. From the beginning, everything was clear. That's it.
Would you like to take a break right now for about 15 minutes?
Let me make an announcement first.
No, go right ahead. An announcement is forthcoming.
Yeah, I'd like to make an announcement before you take your break here, just handed to me. Brad Keziah would like you to know that we have available out there, he has available the sworn depositions of Dr. Lundberg. They're at the JFK Resources Group table in the adjoining room. These depositions prove that JAMA disregarded the evidence that Dr. Crenshaw was in fact where he said he was in the emergency room. It was this deposition of Dr. Lundberg's that to Brad Keziah that was the major reason that JAMA settled this lawsuit, and they're available at the JFK Resources Group table in the adjoining room.
Be back in about 15 minutes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, well, he was there. Well, the interesting thing is, there was a brilliant, we found a brilliant, I have to admit, the person that came down here with something. Basically, it's down to a lawsuit, and they found El Paso newspaper.